wonderful day. So if we can call the meeting to order, and I'm still, my colleagues, Councillor Perks or Councillor Fillion are in the building, please let us know. But we do have, or I did see quorum there. There's quorum. I do have quorum, so let us call the meeting to order.
I don't think so, but check afterwards. I'm going to do the rundown now. Or hold the item.
Okay, so welcome to meeting 25 of the Planning and Growth Management Committee. Welcome to the members of the committee, the other members of council in attendance, and to the members of the public. For those in the room with us, the screen at the back of the room provides real-time updates concerning where we are in the agenda and what's coming up next. If you're not in the room, you can follow us and follow the agenda and debate on your computer, tablet, or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. And the Planning and Growth Management Committee gratefully acknowledges it is meeting on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Creditford Nation, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and home to many diverse Indigenous peoples, and over 4 million other people in Toronto. So welcome. Let's go through the agenda. Are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? Sorry, was that a yes or a no? Nobody. Seeing none. Confirmation of the minutes of the November 15th, 2017 meeting. Moved by Councillor DiCiano. All in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Let's go through the list of items. First item, PG 25.1, Area Specific Amendment to the City's Sign Bylaw, 146 Bloor Street West. There is a request, I think, to withdraw this item. Madam Clerk.
To speak as well, so.
There is a speaker, but only if we aren't going to. Is there someone to speak on it if we withdraw it? Only if we were going to deal with the item, but he's in support of it being withdrawn.
We'll do it at 10 again.
Okay, we have to hold that till 10 o'clock because we timed it. Item PG 25.2, Site-Specific Amendment to the Sign Bylaw, 440 Front Street,
So 10 a.m. as well.
which is also at 10 a.m. I think if we deal with it, everybody's happy, but we have to wait till 10. PG 25.3, Echo Roof Incentive Program Application 77 Glen Boulevard. Staff recommendations is to approve the Echo Roof Incentive Program funding for green roof at 77 Glen Boulevard of 1,073 square meters and an amount up to $7,300 above the pre-approved funding of $100,000. There was an amended report which simply changed the name of the applicant slightly. Moved by Councillor Campbell. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Prioritization of outstanding heritage conservation district studies and interim protective measures. There are speakers, so we will hold that. PG 25.5, proposed transition regulations associated with the amendment to the province's land use planning appeal system. If there aren't any, there are no speakers to that. I will hold it. I have a motion which I will circulate on it. I don't believe it'll be controversial, but it'll give my colleagues a chance to read it before I throw it up on the screen. 25.6, Living in the City Survey. Councillor Ballo wishes to hold. 25.7, Official Plan Review Draft Public Realm Policies. Any questions of staff? Nothing at all. So is there a motion to direct the draft official plan amendment containing public realm policies and draft terms of reference for the block context plan appended to this report, attachment 1 and 3 be endorsed as the basis for public consultation? And there's two other recommendations with that. Moved by Councillor Ballo. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. So why don't we go back and deal with the first item that we were holding that we can't. Oh, Councillor Perks.
Yes, I have a letter which I sent to you and the clerk for an additional item. I'd like to move that we add it to the agenda.
So Councillor Perks is asking that we move as an additional item some recommendations in regards to inclusionary zoning. All in favor? To introduce. Any opposed? That's carried. So, the first item we can deal with is item 25.4. We have 3 speakers for that. The first one is Sherry Hurst. Please come forward. Yes. Oh, it is. We're going too fast. My apologies, Sherry. I can't do this till 10:30. Okay. Look at the speed at which we're moving.
Want to go to 5?
25.5. Well then, because I don't have a chance to do it, can you change
Motion printed out?
this?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Are there any questions of staff in regards to 25.5? So, I will, for a moment, ask of Mr. Haley, and you know I have a motion that staff will put up in a moment, but what are the impacts that you're currently finding with Bill 139, the proposed transition regulations associated with amendments to the province's Land Use Planning Act in regards to the number of appeals that we're finding?
The impact of the proposed legislation with respect to both city legal in terms of the planning law division as well as community planning is that there was a huge increase in the number of appeals since the bill was introduced in May of 2017. Right now, it's probably about 2.5 times the number of appeals that we would have typically have experienced in the 2016 period. So that's a very significant increase. It was as a result of presumably developers and their solicitors being concerned about the impact of the legislation and the change to the new planning regime.
So can you clarify for us now, until when can appeals be heard? And on what can appeals still be? And because the legislation, and what are the brief changes that are coming about with the legislation that's drawing these appeals?
The legislation was previously reported on, but in terms of the new regime, it will result in a different test as well as a 2-stage test that's going to be applied before the new tribunal as opposed to the Ontario Municipal Board, with essentially the net effect that it'll be a conformity or compliance test, which is a much higher test than the current process planning regime in Ontario. There will be greater deference to the decision of City Council, and it was that concern that I think that led to a number of developers deciding to appeal, get their applications in early and then appeal in order to shelter under the old regime. The transition provisions are relatively complex, and Ms. Voumvakis can expand on those, but suffice it to say that until the point of royal assent, which was December of last year, there was an opportunity to shelter, and there continues to be an opportunity to shelter until the legislation is actually proclaimed into force. So in terms of the report that's before you, there are recommendations whereby Council would be asking the province to proclaim the legislation as soon as possible in order to reduce the number of appeals that would be sheltered under the old system.
Can you give us a brief, it's hard to give it brief, but the changes that are happening under the legislation? Currently, time runs out and an application would be appealed for not dealing with it after 180 days. What's the difference under the new legislation?
Maybe what I'll do is I'll pass that over to Ms. Voumvakis and her team. They're on the implementation of Bill 139.
In terms of the changes to, through the chair, sorry.
Through the chair to the chair.
Chair. In terms of the changes to the Planning Act, a number of significant changes have occurred. So matters that were previously submitted under Section 26, which would be part of our official plan review, would go to the province for approval, but the minister's decision was appealable. That change, a change has occurred where the decision of the ministers is no longer appealable. So contrary to the current situation where we're currently in, if I use our employment lands appeal, which I believe most members of council are familiar with, the minister's decision was appealable. Under the new changes to the Act, the minister's decision is not appealable. In terms of secondary plans, which would be, for the most part, adopted under Section 17, those matters could still be challenged, but they cannot, an applicant could not come forward and seek an amendment to a secondary plan within 2 years of council's adoption of that secondary plan, in the absence of council determining that it could amend the secondary plan.
2 years from adoption. If we bring forward a secondary plan after the legislation's enacted, is that still appealable? Amendment to a secondary?
After the legislation, yes, it's appealable, but you can't amend it for 2 years. So once it's in effect, you cannot amend it.
So the period between the time you bring it in, if council approves it and it's appealed, can you continue to file applications to amend it?
I'm going to ask Mr. Healy on that point.
Good.
I feel like we're playing a little bit of ping pong here.
Probably a very good question. That would have to be looked at. Certainly, there's additional regulations that also have not yet been released. The only one that has been released in draft form is the transition regulation. So there are a number of matters that have to be clarified in terms of the legislation through additional regulations, which we have not seen yet. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you on that.
Okay, my time is up. I don't know if anyone else has a question or not. If not, we can go to speakers. Non-members of committee. Sure, we'll open it back up. Go ahead.
It's not so much about this. Will there be a briefing for councillors at some point on what you know and what will happen? Because obviously our residents are asking us questions, and it would be really, really nice if someone in the know came and gave us a briefing.
There will be a report. The report on the legislation that went through in November included a provision for the city solicitor to report back on implementation on Bill 139. So in fact, there is a staff working group that has been already composed, consisting of city planning, the city clerk's office, and city legal. So we have a series of meetings that are scheduled amongst staff to review the additional regulations as they come out in conjunction with the legislation that has now had royal assent, and we will be preparing a package, a report for council in terms of just what does all of this mean to the city in terms of our procedures and protocols.
But I guess I'm going beyond a report, so give us a chance to read it, and then maybe we could have a couple of councillors together or something. We don't have quorum, but...
Ms. Vambakis has a comment on that.
Through the chair, we're suggesting that we conduct sessions at each community council.
Great.
Later on in the year, once we have a better understanding of all the impacts of the bill and its various regulations on both our policies and practices and go forward.
That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Back into committee. Councillor Perks with questions.
So just to be absolutely clear, today, if someone files, they're still filing under the old rules. Today, if somebody appeals, they're still appealing under the old rules. And that continues to be the case until the Lieutenant Governor proclaims these to be in effect, the new rules to be in effect.
Through the chair, that is correct.
Okay.
As long as it's a complete application.
As long as it's a complete application. Thank you.
Councillor Fillion. Okay, no other questions. We'll bring it in for speakers. I have a motion, so I'll do that, and then I'll go to Councillor Fillion. I put the motion forward, and as City Council advised the province that if Bill 139 is not proclaimed into force until April of 2018, there could be potentially 380 privately initiated developments in the City of Toronto, representing 130,000 residential units, including many affordable housing units, that could be appealed for adjudication under the current system then as a result of the delay in the passing of Bill 139 into law, coupled with the proposed regulations, there will likely be significant delays in delivering a significant portion of these housing units in the City of Toronto. I'm moving that, and in my discussions with staff, I've heard that the delay in hearing appeals now could be running between 5 and 7 years. So if you file an appeal now for an incomplete application, it could be a very long time until it's heard. That being said, the number that staff have calculated is 130,000 residential units. That's an awful lot of units in our system. My screen keeps flashing on and off, and I hope it's not something I did to it. That's an awful lot of units within the city that won't be able to get built and won't be in the pipeline for construction due to the delay in the appeals. And in that, as we all know, will be quite a number of affordable housing units. Well, the longer it takes to get an application approved, the more expensive it is. Because if you're planning it now and you don't get approval for 5 to 7 years, the price of those units is going to escalate substantially just to the cost of inflation, never mind the lack of supply within the city. And everything that we're trying to do to bring affordable housing to the market, along with housing units within the city, could come to a grinding halt. So somehow we're going to have to get the resources both at our level, within the legal division and the planning division, to be able to handle these and see if they're minor and they can be settled, and at the provincial level, to get the appeals that are underway, first of all, of our official plan amendments and other policy statements that are held up and have been held up for years, such as our zoning bylaw 213, that's been held up for 5 years now. So every time someone goes to the Committee of Adjustment for a minor variance, those variances may not even be required under the new zoning bylaw, but because of the lengthy appeal that's been there and the lack of an end in sight, it's just generating more and more and more work and making the government bureaucracy just slow down and us look like it's government that's holding it up, when in fact it's the lack of dealing with the official plan amendments and the other amendments and plans that we've made and have been submitted. So the implementation of Bill 139 is like the icing on the cake that's never going to get eaten and is going to be quite stale, I guess, before we actually get a chance to try it. Because the work that's going to be involved now in appeals and the legal work and planning work to defend them, I see as being horrendous. So this is more of a message to try and give the province that you've got to work with us to find a way to get our official plan amendments approved, to get our official plans in place, get our policies in place, and then look at the appeals to see how they relate to those plans and get things resolved. As I don't think holding up development applications for 5 to 7 years, even if we may not like them all, but is a good thing to do within the city. It just grinds things to a halt. So that's my motion. Are there any questions? Councillor Fillion, you wanted to speak?
Well, just to continue with your cake analogy and to paraphrase a schmaltzy song from the 60s, I think someone left the cake out in the rain. Each year you get a little bit more cynical, and each year you realize you're not nearly cynical enough. If the province really thought that this legislation was important, why would they deliberately prop the door open so that we continue with the old system for years? It's just so disappointing. I'll say no more.
Okay. So I have put a motion forward. All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. And the recommendations from the staff in the report, I'll also move. All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. 25.5 is dealt with. I'm trying to look at the clock to see if we can deal with the sign issues, but I'm off by 3 minutes. So, can I deal with questions if there are any on them?
No, we should start the item at 10 a.m.
I've never wanted to see the clock go faster in the morning. Okay. Councillor Barlow, you held 25.6. Can we start that? And if it's going to be lengthy, then we'll go back to do the sign ones, and if it's not, we'll deal with them first. Questions on 25.6, living in the city?
I was just curious, I was going through this survey, which was really interesting, and I'm just curious why staff did not go a little bit into the affordability factor with some of these questions. So I thought it'd be really interesting to see, for example, how much of the income these people are paying on housing. How much of these condos were rental, for example, so that we can have a better understanding with data if the condo market is really replacing the rental market, but in particularly on the affordability factor. So I was just wondering if there's any particular reason why you did not go into that.
Through the chair, thanks for the question. This was primarily a survey focusing on demographics and the demographic outcomes of residential intensification. As such, we were very interested in affordability from our planning perspective, but the limits of this survey were primarily aimed at getting a picture of the people who are living there, some of their preferences regarding housing, as well as some of their identified quality of life issues, which did include affordability, but due to the format of the survey and the budget of the exercise, we were a bit limited on delving too deeply into some of these questions.
Can you repeat that again? Sorry.
Through the chair, if I could further add, the questions, Councillor, that you are raising are all very important ones, and I think as we advance and do future surveys, that is definitely something that we would be including in our questionnaire.
Okay, so I don't need to place a motion or anything like that. That will be something that you'll be including in the future surveys?
Absolutely, particularly in this current market situation.
Yeah, because I thought everything was really helpful. It's just that you're missing that big part of it. So it would be really, for me, really important to understand that part, and I didn't get it. Okay, so I'm done.
Are there other questions of staff? And can someone come and shut this screen off? I know, but it's flashing like I'm in front of a... Thank you. No, my apologies to members of the... I have a screen that's flashing at me as if I'm supposed to buy something or it's a new sale that's come up and Sears is closed. So I have, who is responding to the questions? So I noticed in the survey which you sent to me that a number of the questions are, all the answers were aggregated, the questions were aggregated. For example, deciding where to live and the question able to walk or cycle was one question. Another one was vehicle or bicycle parking. It's one question instead of two. And then the issue with bedrooms, I found it hard to identify whether it's people moving up or moving down or what age it was. So can we do better with the questions? I'm trying to put this as a positive question.
Chair, thanks for the question. Somewhat related to the affordability question, from a planning perspective, it would be our desire in this type of survey instrument to delve into all the nuances of these questions. We work closely with a consultant on this, and our consensus coming away from our approach to this survey was that we wanted an effective instrument.
I can hardly hear you, sorry.
Sorry. We wanted an instrument, a survey instrument that would be effective and that people would respond to, and to try to achieve the highest response rate that we could possibly get, given the conditions that we are surveying in, which is an unaddressed mail survey, which doesn't often have a stupendous response rate, as some people may know. So our approach essentially was to try to create a survey that was effective through not too many questions, not too many choices, sort of bite-sized questions, and to get around the length of the survey so that it didn't discourage people from answering it. So in our minds, we wanted to separate out walking and cycling, vehicle and bicycle parking, and the number of bedrooms. For example, moving into more or less bedrooms. But just due to the nature of our survey instrument and its format, we were forced to amalgamate some of these questions.
If I could add through the chair, as we conduct future surveys, we're always learning from the past and learning what we should do better and differently. And to a certain extent, we are limited by our funding resources that we direct to it. But given a number of the questions and issues that we see affecting the city, our future survey will delve further into some of these key areas.
When's the next survey?
There isn't one specifically targeted at this point in time, but I would be considering doing one in the during the next term of council, 2019, perhaps developing the questionnaire and getting out with it the end of 2019, so it could help inform other policy pieces that we bring forward to committee and council.
What's the cost of the survey?
The cost of the survey was $200,000.
And how much of that is internal and how much is external? Is part of it the book? And
That cost is all external in terms of the survey itself. We're not including staff salaries within that.
And what was the response rate in the 3 suburban municipalities? Number of responses?
Through the chair, thanks for the question. So our response rate in 2016 for Scarborough was 8.8%. In North York, it was 8.2%.
Number of units.
Oh, the number of units?
How many people actually responded in Scarborough, North York, or Toronto?
Oh, certainly, yeah. So in Scarborough Centre, we had 148 responses. In North York, 375 responses. And in Etobicoke, 236 responses.
Toronto?
Toronto, in downtown, we had 2,445 responses. Also in some of the suburban areas, ground-related secondary plan areas and mid-rise and high-rise secondary plan areas had, as an aggregate, respectively 347 responses for ground-related SPs and 1,614 responses from the denser secondary plan areas.
Sorry, now you unconfused me, now you confused me. I'm sorry. I just want to know, and you understand, because I've got 148 responses in Scarborough, 375 in North York, and 236 in Etobicoke.
Those are in the centers.
In overall, then, in those areas?
If I had a calculator, I could quickly pull those.
Give me a rough number.
In the centers, probably about 700, I would say, in the suburban areas. And in the secondary plan areas, it's hard for me to estimate. I'd probably have to get back to you on that.
Thank you. Questions, Councillor Campbell, you had them?
So what's the reason for the survey of just the centers? Because, I mean, if you're looking at the center of Etobicoke, it's like, you know, it's 2,700 people. I mean, I don't know how relevant a survey is when you have 236 responses. I mean, there really is, I mean, Etobicoke, to say there's a center in Etobicoke, and maybe Councillor DiCiano he might disagree or he might wholeheartedly agree, but there's not much of a center in Etobicoke, quite frankly. There will be. There will be. And it'll be, yeah. But so of what relevance really are those statistics?
Through the chair, thanks for the question. So we surveyed in Toronto. The purpose of the survey was to survey households that have recently moved into or moved into recently built units. And so we're looking at all areas of residential intensification in the city. So that includes the downtown, the centers, and 29 secondary plan areas. So our approach was to look at a whole bunch of areas in addition to the 4 centers, which we did look at in the last survey. So we've expanded our area and focused more on recently built housing than on all residents. So although the numbers may appear to be low, we're sampling a smaller population.
I think if I could add through the chair, the relevance is in totality may not seem significant just from a survey, but the survey is one of many inputs into developing policy. So for example, if we were, as we probably will be in the next 3 to 4 years, looking at the centers across the city, some of the policy frameworks are getting dated. We'll want to be updating those. So it's important to be guided by all kinds of inputs. We'll be out having community meetings, for example. We'll gather data from surveys. We'll develop policy options. So it's just one of many inputs, and it's important, I think, as planners for us to undertake these kind of surveys regularly to understand, in many ways, what's on people's minds.
So, okay, so follow-up question, is there not a danger in drawing, in making presumptions and drawing conclusions and developing policy that may affect residents of Scarborough when the survey is so heavily, so, overwhelmingly skewed and based on data from downtown? I mean, so what applies? So basically, this if you're drawing policy, if you're making assumptions and making policy based on findings from this review, which is 90% based on the respondents from downtown, and now we're saying that will apply to residents of Scarborough or Etobicoke or North York, is there not a danger in that?
Through the chair, the survey is one of many inputs that we do when we're undertaking any form of analysis. And given the fact that often we have time series data where we do studies over a period of time, such as the employment survey, which we do annually, we look at the changes in the data, but again, it's only one input. So we're cautious, particularly when there is a very low response rate.
Okay, that's good, thank you, because I would be very cautious. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Councillor Perks.
I just want to see if I'm reading this correctly. Looking at page 43, travel mode for commute, it looks like, with the exception of the downtown where people are walking, roughly it's a 50-50 split for people who've moved recently into where they live between transit and automobiles. Is that right? I got that right?
Through the chair, sorry, could you repeat that?
So looking at figure 20, travel mode for commute, with the exception of the downtown where 60% of people are walking, it looks like people who have recently moved into where they live in Toronto, it's roughly a 50-50 mode split, transit and automobile.
In these areas of intensification across the city, that's what it appears from this graph. There is a little bit of a difference in the way people commute to school and to work.
Yeah.
But according to this graph, that's correct.
So the mode share for people moving into a new unit is higher than the mode share generally in the City of Toronto, which I think is about 30, 35% for transit. So the mode share should be going up. Or people who have recently moved, it's higher.
That would appear so.
Okay, so, and just remind me, how many people are moving into Toronto every year? How much is our population growing? 30, 40,000, something like that? I'm amazed Mr. Lintern doesn't just know this.
Through the chair, approximately 50,000 per annum.
Approximately 50. So if half of the 50,000 people are taking transit as their main commute, that's 25,000 people we should be adding every year as transit riders. and their commute, that's 250 days, 500 trips, so that's, we should be seeing 12 million new transit trips a year? Just to keep up with what this data is telling us?
Through the chair, I'm not sure that we can make that direct connection without doing some additional analysis.
I can do it in my head. Okay, well, I'll pursue this.
Other questions? Other speakers? Councillor Fillion.
Just a suggestion that maybe we look at a different way of doing this next time. I think the quantitative isn't working so well because of the lack of responses, and I think also, as the chair pointed out, some of the questions don't make a lot of sense, and the example being bicycle parking and car parking. The people who one would be important to are probably a separate group from the ones that the other would be important to, for example. And that's the kind of thing that would be very obvious if it was more of a focus group kind of approach than a survey that people don't fill out. So just a thought.
So I'll comment on it because I came back. When you talked about, I really questioned the methodology in what we're doing. I know you sent out close to 50,000 surveys and didn't get a great response, I guess, to them. So that's a question, especially in the suburban areas and the high-intensity development areas. Secondly, when I look at the actual questionnaire, there were 29 questions, so I understand you may not want to add more, but deciding where to live, where it says able to walk or cycle everywhere, there were 12 sub-questions. Splitting that to 13 wouldn't have been the number that are here that difficult or a thing or an issue to do. And the same thing as my colleague said, the next question, things that are important to you, vehicle or bicycle parking, one line when there's 20 questions under that subheading. And then an issue that's important to many of us, why would you want to move? Question 19, there's 17 sub-questions, but it says more or fewer bedrooms. That's, to me, like not even getting an answer, because I don't know what it is. Is it more or is it less? Is it larger or is it smaller? And those are the things that we're often challenged with when we try and work with the industry, because many of us feel that there's a lack of the larger family housing units and stacked units, but we don't know for sure what the public's feeling and people that have actually moved in, and that goes through this. So, I mean, even when my colleague, Councillor Perks, was pointing out how important transit might be, the same thing, figure 20, it says in downtown, almost 60% of the people pick walking. 32% pick public transit, which could include GO trains, but 12% are bicycle. That at least shows me that a lot of people want to live near where they work if the stat is right, but then it also questions what's the importance of the bicycles, and I can't go back to the cycling because I've got that bulked with something else, so I can't really decipher what the information is. And the second way is mailing it out and getting responses. I don't know if that's the very best way we could do it. I don't know if my colleagues would want to actually send the survey out to the email list, but have it come back to staff, not to us, so we wouldn't skew it. Because between us, we probably have, with 44 members of council plus the mayor, probably over 100,000 to 200,000 people, if not more, that this could be sent out to. And then it could come back on a ward basis or some way that you could work to find where the information could be a little bit more detailed, in particular to the issues that are the current questions of the time or the day when you put it out. And secondly, the methodology to get it out, even if you use the methods that we have as an extra to it. But somehow to do that, or even post the survey on the city's website and let people know it's there and fill it out just by telling us where they came from. But technology is changing and the information is critical to us, so anything you can do to improve upon it and get us that information, I think, would be helpful and be able to see that the decisions that we're making in here are the ones that people would like to see us make or addressing the issues that are important to them. Otherwise, I think the motion is to receive it. Am I correct? It is Planning and Growth Committee receive this report for information, which I'll move, and I'll thank staff for their work on it and bring the work to us. All in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. We've passed the time of 10 o'clock. I can go back to item number 1 while there is a speaker on it. The speaker is Michael Foderick from McAulty Tetralt, but are you satisfied if we withdraw this? So I'll move the motion to receive this item. What do I do with it now? I'll do whatever the clerk tells me to do. That the item be withdrawn from the agenda as the applicant withdrew their application. Any questions, any comments, any speakers? All those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Item number 2, which was scheduled for 10 o'clock as well. Signed bylaw amendment for 440 Front Street West. There are no speakers. I believe that the applicant is happy and the staff are happy and the local councillor is happy, who have all worked very hard on this. So I will move the staff recommendations to approve the application in the report. Any speakers, any comments? All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. That brings me out to 25.4, prioritization of outstanding heritage conservation district studies and interim protective measures. We have some speakers. Why don't we have the speakers come forward? My apologies, Sherry. I'd called you earlier and I made you sit down. You're first. Sherry Hurst of the Western Heritage Conservation District. Then I have Susan Stock and Tina Leslie. Have a seat. There's a microphone there, which should be, you can turn on. You get 5 minutes, up to 5 minutes.
Is it on? Yep.
Oh,
Starting now?
I can't.
You
I'm
can?
not 10:30. And I really, really, really want to hear from you, Sherry. We'll be here.
8 is the only remaining item.
So why don't we? Pardon me? Hang on. So, no. And Madam Speaker, you're the head rule. I know you are. So no, we can't start that yet. So we've done all the signs. We have a 9-minute wait for that. Because we are so efficient today.
We could do it.
Well, we can bring it to the floor if you want.
About that item 8, I do want to do it too.
Oh, I have to talk to staff first on that item, so I can't for the moment. We have a short delay, a pause in the program, a commercial intervention over here. So we just have to wait for a moment. Sorry. So members of committee, Councillor DiCiano and Councillor Campbell, staff have suggested we can take a formal break for 7 minutes and come back at 7:30, which we can do, so we can, 10:30. Because we cannot start the signs until then. We've done those. And we did 2. Staff wanted to speak to me for a moment about it. So a motion to take a break?
Recess until 10:30.
Recess until 10:30. All those in favor? Any opposed? Thank you. Okay, we can call the meeting back to order. Can I get my colleagues' attention? Hello? Hello? Okay. Councillor Nunziata, my colleagues, we had a nice recess. We're back. It's 10:32. The item we have is 25.4 for the third time today. And on her third debut, I have Sherry Hurst. And Sherry, and to the other members of the public that are here, if you haven't spoken before, you have 5 minutes to speak, a maximum of. At the end of it, if there are questions from members of council that are non-members of the committee or members of the committee, they will ask them of you, and then we will go to the next speaker. I will start a clock, which runs over there, so you can watch it yourself, so I won't surprise you and say you're finished, but I will stop you at 5 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Please go forward.
My name is Sherry Hurst, and I'm the president of the Weston Heritage Conservation District. The Weston HCD study bylaw was passed in 2004. With the area having over 2,500 homes, it was deemed necessary to proceed in phases. Phase 1 was completed and passed in 2007. During that process, we formed a board, drew up bylaws, opened a bank account, interviewed and hired a consultant, photographed the neighborhood, researched the homes in the area, created our own research form long before anyone else did in order to keep track of the research, and with the help of our councillor, we raised enough money to pay for a consultant and get Phase 1 passed. Then we moved on to Phase 2. Very soon afterwards, we expanded the boundaries of Phase 2 to include approximately 599 homes. Fundraising and research continued until we had managed to raise $20,000 from the community, plus a $49,000 grant from Trillium. The money received from Trillium was meant to hire a heritage consultant once the community volunteers had done the research. This is when we heard about the new HCDs in Toronto, the policy and procedures that one is to go by to document the built heritage in a district. Even though it tripled the amount of work necessary to complete the research, we carried on, even creating our own digital version of the built form and landscape survey, where researchers can enter information on a property right into a computer. We transcribed every 5 years of assessment records from Weston to learn when the houses in the area were built. This amounted to the equivalent of over 13,000 houses because we did it for every 5 years, every house, all the way back to 1881. We also collected appropriate plans, surveys, and research on the people who have lived in the houses. We were beginning to approach the homeowners with the landscape and built form survey when it was made known to us that we were not on the city's priority list for heritage conservation districts. It should not proceed further. You can imagine my shock when, after all this work, we were told there was a new prioritization system and we didn't make it. I had a couple of meetings with Preservation Services to find out how this could happen, when would we be considered, and what were we to do with the Trillium grant. After reviewing the prioritization system, I wrote a letter to Preservation Services on June 4th, 2015. In it, I described how we were passed over, in my opinion, in the first prioritization process through discrepancies in the system, and then again in February 2015 report, this time by new districts that were not there before. I also mentioned that the size of Phase 2 in the report was old and needed to be altered. It was suggested that we go ahead and hire the heritage consultant who would then do the rest of the research that we were unable to finish. We did this, and the consultant arranged for 3 buses and carloads of students to come and visit Weston so they could assist in the research as part of their school projects. 8 months later, we have a report from the consultant, 3 pictures have been taken for each property, and the digital built form and landscape survey form has been filled out for each property. So what comes next? I didn't know because we were not on the priority list, and even more new HCDs had come in. I realize there can be areas that are in extreme danger and might need to be parachuted in to help them to become districts. But with the priority system slanted, again, fairly in my opinion, towards areas of mass development where Weston is quickly losing just 1 house at a time, or where archaeological possibility is considered more important than archaeology never done, I couldn't see Weston ever being high enough in priority. So after all of this, you can be assured that I am more than happy to see Weston Phase 2 at the top of a list for a change, as in the Table 1 in the report for action. But there are some things I don't understand. First of all, in the first recommendation, what exactly is the strategy for scheduling the outstanding HCDs? The report says that the majority of HCD plans and studies are expected to be complete or substantially complete in 2018. So will they go on to the outstanding HCDs in the order they are presented in Table 1? Will the scheduling be based on the date when the area was nominated, together with all the other objectives and divisional priorities, et cetera, et cetera? It does not actually say so in the report. Will that date be of higher value, or will it be thrown in with the rest of the criteria, and so Weston could very easily find itself routed out again? The many objectives, priorities, and initiatives listed sound like all the criteria that has stopped Weston from getting prioritized in the past. Also mentioned is the division's capacity to initiate particular study areas based upon their size and complexity. Does that mean Weston will get penalized for having such a large area to be studied? I notice my time's almost up, so I am going to skip over other things I'm worried about, but to my conclusion, and I'm going to say that the last thing I meant to come here was to point fingers, but the frustration is going on 10 years long now, and I'm seeing no end in sight. Preservation Service has done a wonderful job with the HCDs they have completed. They have made time for meetings with me to clarify and assist us. They have commented on the report that our heritage consultant has completed. Unfortunately, none of it brings Weston closer to getting a district. Taking into account the year the potential districts were authorized is a great step, but what is going to happen in 2018? After 2018, sorry.
Thank you. Any questions of the deputant? Not seeing any. Thank you very much. Sorry, Councillor Campbell.
So the report makes reference to Weston Area Phase 2,
Yes.
and it was from 2004.
We had, our initial bylaw was for the whole area for all Phase 1, 2, and 3, and then we split them up in order to make them a little bit workable into Phase 1, 2, and 3.
How long have you been involved in this?
From the beginning.
Which was when?
2004, probably 2003, because we did a lot of research to see how we would go about getting a district first.
And had you been given assurances in the past that, you know, this would move along and there would be progress shown in terms of getting a designation?
We have, I would not say, I'm not sure what you mean by assurances. Every time we get contacted, we were in touch with Preservation Services, we had to go through the story again because there was always a new person. And that's probably
That happens over 14 years.
Yeah, that's true. But it's also the only contact we ended up having would be with new people. So it would always be initial contact. So I would not say, no one has ever come out and said, you're next. Right. No, if that's what you mean.
Why do you think Weston's been ignored?
I think it's because we're not downtown. I think it's because squeaky wheel gets the grease, and I didn't do that. I listened to the representatives that I talked to and basically went away to let them do their job, which is, I still think is right.
Did city staff ever agree to do a tour of the area or meet you in the area?
The last person that did a tour of the area would have been Scott Barrett, which I forget when he worked there. Okay. Was a number of years ago.
And you said some of the homes were built in the 1880s?
We have homes that are over 150 years old.
Right. And you said that it's now being taken apart piece by piece, home by home. How rapid is that pace?
I don't have any numbers with me, but we are in contact with the councillor when it comes to someone who wants to tear down or demolish or change or whatever. And we go to meetings all the time on those. So I honestly couldn't give you exact numbers. But it is under duress. It's under extra pressure because of the new train and everything.
Do any of these very old homes have heritage designations to protect them?
One.
One, okay. And last question is, so how many homes are over 100 years old in the neighborhood, in the area?
I would say over 100 years old. In phase 2, it'd be a total guess, but there's got to be at least, I hate to, there's got to be at least 100, I would think.
I beg your pardon?
There's got to be at least 100 because we've got
Okay.
599 houses in phase 2.
Yeah, no, I know the area, yeah. Weston Collegiate, right? It's,
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the deputation.
Thank you. Just so I can understand, this is phase 2. Was phase 1 reviewed, or what was phase 1?
Phase 1, what was phase 1?
Yeah.
It was Little Avenue, is that what you mean, like the area of phase 1? It was Little Avenue and part of Weston Road, plus Cross Street, George Street, some of Church Street. So it was a fairly small area, but it...
Was it considered an HCD in the end?
Yes, it's been totally passed. It did go to the OMB for a bit of an amendment, and then it got passed.
And this area, phase 2, is how large?
599 houses.
In what area are they?
It encompasses, it starts at the railroad tracks on the west, Church Street on the north, Pine Street on the east, and then it kind of does a jog. No, it's below John Street. What's the, anyway, Spring Mount and that area down there.
And there's a phase 3 you said as well?
Phase 3, yes, would go from Pine Street to James Street.
So how many houses would be in there?
I'm not sure. We haven't even looked at
Is
that.
it a large area?
No, it's a smaller area. Phase 2 was enlarged because more residents wanted to be in on it because houses, we had a huge meeting at the OMB on one house in the extra part of phase 2. And when that came out to the public, I had people phoning me and saying, I want in the district.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Susan Stock.
Morning, everyone.
Good morning. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I don't know what to say after what Sherry had to say, except ditto. Basically the same story. My name is Susan Stock. I am chair of the Summerhill Residences of the Summerhill Heritage Group, and I'm also on the board of the Summerhill Residents Association. In 2004, I joined the Toronto and East York Preservation Panel, working with Brian Gallagher, Don Purdy, Marcia Cuthbert, and Scott Barrett. And during that period of Toronto's history, we were moving, I think, from amalgamation and Mel Lastman, Mike Harris provisions to being concerned about development in the downtown core. At that time, the idea was to start with heritage conservation districts, and we were sold on the idea that this might be a great idea to help preserve the area of Summerhill, 320 houses. I gave a flyer, has just gone out to you, which has a short history of Summerhill and a lotting. That's an old lotting, according to the research that we did. We helped Preservation Services develop the forms that they use to diagnose and record the heritage and built form for the neighborhoods. We filled it out. I've taken photographs. I had neighbors who gave me their 3-megapixel pictures in the days when you couldn't convert from PC to Apple computers, and I spent millions of hours. Presently, my computer is 3/4 full of heritage information on Summerhill. The only difference I can say that Sherry didn't do is that she didn't have T-shirts. We had T-shirts. We fundraised. We went from a time when it was a $4,000 fee to have a heritage architect help you with the study. It then ballooned to $70,000, and we were told that we were sidelined until we could collect the $70,000, hopefully from Section 37 funds. Summerhill is like a village. It's bordered by the railway tracks, the ravines, David Balfour Park and the reservoir, which will be under construction soon, and Yonge Street on the west. The houses were constructed first for the stagecoach magnet. Mr. Thompson, who named Summerhill, was Charles Street after himself, and Shaftesbury was Thompson after himself. He apparently went into financial arrears. The whole lot of Lot 17 was then broken up and subdivided. And that was the beginning of everyone else being allowed to enjoy the neighborhood. So some of our homes, Summerhill House does no longer exist. Michael Vaughn's grandfather tore down the house and redeveloped it, and there are now lovely homes on Summerhill Gardens that we can thank him for. So the development actually shows, it's a microcosm of development of the city of Toronto, going back to the stagecoach era when one man owned the entire lot, when workers started moving in and workers' cottages. We have Tacoma, we have Ottawa Street, we have Shaftesbury Avenue. We also have the illustrious James Avon Smith, whose #1 Spadina is now touted as one of the preeminent redevelopments of heritage fabric in the city. He owned Lot 22, which had 8 houses, which he developed. So he developed that lot. He was an early developer and an architect. My colleague Jen Fallis and I actually went to the archives and found his will, or lack thereof, and we found out what he left and who he left it to, and discovered that 81R Woodlawn Avenue East, which is owned by an illustrious heritage preservationist, was as of last August in fear of being actually ripped down. So thanks to Preservation Services, we stepped in and the original proposal was retracted. Now the house beside me at 116 Shaftesbury Avenue has a proposal which is before the Committee of Adjustment on January 24th for a third story addition and possible demolition. All this to say, I started this, we were accepted in 2007 for a heritage conservation study. It's now 2018. I started this when I was 54. I'm now 68, and I would like to see before I retire, because I'm still working full-time, that we could go ahead. I appreciate the problems in this city, but Toronto, downtown Toronto, and especially lovely areas like Summerhill, which had sort of mass migrations of people. Lots of people bought in the 70s. They're now retiring out and moving out and leaving the houses to the younger generation who may not appreciate the significance of the properties. And so we're seeing a different kind of renovation. The houses are,
Susan, I need you to wrap up.
Okay, the houses for the most part are 100 years old. They're now being renovated, but only just recently have people started to actually change the streetscapes and the landscaping around. And so we are in imminent peril. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes, Councillor.
Very quick question. Thank you for this. This is great. It sounds as if you are in the same predicament as all the other groups on this list. Are you doing building by building individual listings and designations now?
Yes. There are well, that's what we're having to do, yes, because of the actual incremental changes that are being done. Most of the renovations have been to the backs of the houses.
Right, which is okay.
Which, you know, is livable. There's been some changes to the windows. That's not major, and it's reversible. But what's happening now with the third generation of people moving in is that they are looking for that, you know, underground drive-through garage and, you know, a modern facade, and that now is going to erode. I mean, we're at the point right now with 81R, she wanted to change it basically into a very modern concrete bunker. And this was a James Avon Smith original house, we've got it 1890 so far. We haven't pinned it down. And so I'm very concerned because we are at a tipping point. We've just managed to hold on, but I think no longer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Not seeing any. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
I have Tina Leslie. Is Tina here? Welcome, Tina. Same thing, 5 minutes.
Oops.
Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words as president of the Junction Heritage Conservation District. The Junction HCD Board is pleased to support the recommendations in the HPS report. It is wonderful to have the first phase of our proposed HCD approved for its heritage study. But we too have reservations with the proposed timelines and are concerned that when our study commences, multiple sections of our heritage built form will be gone. The ever-increasing development pressures to demolish our old chorus and heritage built form fabric, to intensify without any meaningful mechanisms to mitigate the destruction, signals a death knell for our community's vision of creating a junction HCD. It will be too late when entire blocks of our historic Main Street are obliterated, and the impending damage is not restricted to the Main Street. We are observing a proliferation of alteration occurrences and an increase in the magnitude of the alterations in the adjoining residential neighborhoods. The frustration level in our community is at an all-time high, especially when moderate intensification was anticipated. Thankfully, approval of this HPS report is a positive baby step. Given that none of these new HCDs will be added to the 2018 work plan until existing in-process studies are complete, and as an election year with a truncated work year, realistically, it will be 2019 before any of these newly chosen studies begin, and potentially 2020 or 2021 before some of these 13 outstanding HCD studies commence. With the rate of development applications resulting in significant alterations of our streetscapes, there won't be much left of a junction HCD Phase 1 to study by 2019, never mind 2020 or 2021. Our contiguous collection of authentic chorus and heritage buildings will be gone forever, unless proactive action is taken to effectively counter the impending loss of multiple buildings that contribute to the junction character and streetscape. It has been clarified that there are no tools to mitigate inappropriate redevelopment in our future HCD. And although this HPS report acknowledges interim protective measures as plural in the title and on page 9, the one available interim protection measure is woefully inadequate. I implore you to provide appropriate funding in the budget for all of these HCD studies to proceed forthwith after the municipal election in January 2019. Waiting is demoralizing for our volunteers and to the many community supporters who are frustrated to learn that we are helpless to stem the tide of destruction. The Junction HCD, or the Junction, has a vibrant history spanning more than 140 years, and we could tell you many, many stories, but I am cognizant of my time. And the intent of the HCD was to be a microcosm of that former West Toronto city. It is important to understand that the areas of the Junction referred to in the HPS report on page 1 and 2 that were approved in 2014 by 2 community councils reflect this microcosm vision, which is broader than the Phase 1 segment recommended for study, which begs the question, when will the remaining segments be studied? Page 9 of the HPS report refers to 5 additional pending HCD nominations that won't be considered in this round of prioritization. Perhaps the remaining phases of our Junction HCD will be included with them, if it's not too late. We thank the HPS staff for this report and for all of their time and tireless efforts to preserve Toronto's history with limited resources and lacking any necessary effective tools that a world-class city deserves. The intrinsic value of heritage is part of the city's economic future. Thank you.
Questions? Councillor Doucette.
Thank you for coming yet again, Tina. I saw you at we had representatives at Preservation when this report came.
Correct.
You're now here, and I understand you'll be joining me tomorrow at Etobicoke Community Council when we actually try and designate. So I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Susan. I know the answer. Because all these HCDs are still in the line, in the queue, waiting, are you and the community having to do building by building as we see new development coming in?
Yes, we are. And similar to what we heard Sherry Hurst and others, our committee took it upon ourselves to try to gather the research and to fill out the forms, do the survey work that was necessary, gather all the research evidence that we needed in order to create those listings. But as lay people, that takes a long time to put those together. And then we don't really have a process to get them moving forward quickly. We understood from conversations with our preservation panel that there was a backlog of properties that are sitting that haven't yet even gotten listed or designated.
So my understanding, we've got 550 roughly buildings in the queue to be listed, and then after that, we have to get them designated. So do you know the time frame? Maybe I should ask staff this, but do you know the time frame? I mean, for instance, I know you handed to staff at the preservation meeting all the information you could find on a particular building, which right now is down to be demolished because there's a new development coming in on Dundas.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know the time frame of when we can actually get that building listed? Do you have any idea from time frame? If not, I'll ask staff.
No, other than if I handed in as much research as possible and made the task as simple as possible for Preservation Services staff to verify and confirm the evidence that we put forward, they would be able to expedite. But we don't really understand what that means. If it's next month's agenda or 6 months, we don't have time to wait because we know that the applicant can file an application at any time, and we need to be ahead of them.
So volunteers, as we've heard, can do all this work, can get all the paperwork, get all the photographs, all the studies, all the surveys, but city staff actually have to go through and double check because otherwise it's not official. Is that correct? Do you feel that the volunteers doing this work does help our staff move this forward?
We hope so, but
so we need more staff on our end to verify what you are all working hundreds of thousands of hours doing.
because it takes a lot more effort to do it building by building, and sure, you can group buildings, but it still takes just as much time to find out the information on this building and the one beside it.
Thank you very much, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes, you will. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions of the deputant? Not seeing any. Thank you for coming. The next person I have, hopefully I pronounce it right, is it Yui Semrau? Well, I have a UWE on here.
Yes, it's Uwe Semrau.
Uwe?
Uwe, yes.
I did, okay. I got the second part right.
Chair Shiner, fellow committee members, good morning. Thank you for giving our society the opportunity to comment on the item regarding this prioritization of HCD studies. My name is Uwe Semrau. I'm the Vice President of the Beach and East Toronto Historical Society, and I bring remarks which represent the position of the board rather than myself. As one might expect from any prioritization exercise, those parties which end up at the top of the list would be very happy, and those that end up at the bottom would be very unhappy. Unfortunately, we find ourselves to be beyond unhappy. When one ends up at the bottom of a prioritization list, the unhappiness is somewhat tempered by knowing that at least you made it on the train. However, when one finds out that after more than 10 years of having heritage interests being expressed by a wide range of parties, and one finds out that you didn't even make it on the train, it becomes demoralizing. I'll go through a brief history of the HCD nomination submitted to HPC for Queen Street East in the Beach. On August 20th, 2008, this committee recommended approval of item PG 080050 an official plan amendment to authorize Section 37 funding of heritage conservation districts in accordance with attached Appendix A, which was a list of heritage conservation districts, which included the beach, naming Queen Street East the heart of the beach. And in November 12, Council approved urban design guidelines for Queen Street East, stating as an introduction, the beach is a neighborhood rich with history, while at the same time having aspirations to be a modern, sustainable community. Queen Street East is a street which its small town charm and proximity to the eastern beaches and Lake Ontario make it one of Toronto's important tourist destination neighborhoods. Then on May 6, 2013, we submitted our nomination to HPS. And then during September 2015, HPS, our society, held discussions with Councillor McMahon and toured the area. In November 2015, HPS prepared a map of the study area, which was accepted by our society. And then in February 2017, we were advised in writing that a heritage planner would be assigned, that the review of our nomination would now proceed, and that it should take no more than 30 days. And then in November of last year, during the Toronto Heritage meeting of Enoch Turner School, a senior staff member recommended that a public meeting be held on our nomination in January 2018. So things looked like they were progressing quite well. So it is understandable that after all the interest expressed by the city, all the work already conducted by HPS staff, and all the effort by local volunteers into preparing compelling nomination, we find great disappointment in being excluded from the prioritization process, essentially to be held in abeyance only for consideration on a case-by-case basis, ineligible for interim protection measures, and unable to make requests for heritage considerations in development proposals along Queen Street East. The Society is very concerned that not only the heritage assets in the beach and East Toronto, but also all across the city are being lost or are under threat of being lost because of the inability to quickly move the assets identified into authorized for study phase. I think it's that particular phase that's important because it qualifies you for interim protection measures, which we don't have, and also allows you to have heritage considerations in development proposals. So thank you for hearing us, and we look forward to an opportunity for a productive case-by-case review.
Are there questions of the deputant? I don't hear any.
Nope.
Thank you very much for coming. I have Leslie Thompson.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Leslie Thompson. I'm here on behalf of the Harvard Village Residents Association. I live in that neighborhood. I'm also president of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. You have a presentation in front of you, and indeed there's also one on the screen behind you that's in color. So I'm singing the same chorus, actually, as my other sort of heritage enthusiast colleagues. We need some interim protection. But I'll start by showing you who we are. So Harvard Village, this is the map that you have is the original city of Toronto. It's 1857. We were sort of the northwest corner of the city. We are bounded by Bloor Street, Bathurst Street, Spadina, and College Street. We do have some heritage designated buildings, and we have two HCDs. So just using the city's own records here, we have this is where our heritage buildings are, and we have put in place our phase one, which was approved in 2004. and Phase 2, which is approved in 2009. We began Phase 3 in 2008, and it was proposed for study in 2013 and approved, but not prioritized. So you can see that from the map that the original Phase 1s and Phase 2 are really, they're basically 5 streets. And we're proposing to do the rest of the neighborhood and make Harvard Village a heritage conservation district in totality. We are, how do I say this? The context is that we are a neighborhood, and we have a very high percentage of homes that of a high historic value and have many architectural features, you know, and but it's also quite a social unit too, a community unit. We've been a neighborhood for over 130 years. So we need urgent protection from heritage value, to protect our heritage value. I'm going to just show you some examples. I've got many, many more here. Here we have a house, what it looked like in 2015, what it looks like today. They put metal cladding on it, even they've radically changed the style of it. We would call this an example of a non-contributing renovation. And we're losing a lot of them to this particular threat. We also have risks in terms of development and density. Here you'll see the house in 2007. We've lost the barge boards. We've lost the single-family dwelling, and it's become a multifamily unit. We also have demolition by neglect, as I'm sure my other colleagues have as well, which is quite a threat, and often it's followed by fire. So you'll notice in this particular example, 2007, we still had although it is not in great shape, we had the portico and the spandrels and spindles, the stained glass windows, the decorative brickwork. Well, it suffered a fire in 2017. So who knows what will happen on that particular property. It has no protection at all. And it's not alone. There have been others, quite a few others. So we feel we're worth preserving because we have one, design value. We've got a large number of homes. The Toronto Bay and Gable, lots of Gothic revivals, Second Empire, and homes with Richardson Romanesque attributes. Many of the attributes are still in very good condition. We were a neighborhood that had some prominent buildings, including George and Samuel Barton, William McBean, William St. Croix, Frederick Clements, Charles Richard Sleeman Dinnick, and many others. But I think most of all, when you walk down our streets, there is, and as Eric Arthur said, there is this rhythm to the Bay and Gable, the shadows that go with the streets, with the setbacks, with the height, and the trees as well. So it's more than just these features that needs protection. We also have a fair amount of historic value. As I said, we've been around for over 130 years. We were originally in Lord Simcoe's park lots 16, 17, and 18. And this 23 block area has been a neighborhood. We've had waves of immigration come through since the 1880s. The British, the Russian Jewish populations, the Italians, Portuguese, many of whom still live in the neighborhood, as well as Chinese immigrants and refugees.
Leslie, I need you to wrap up.
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. We have other values too. I hadn't realized how quickly it goes. Thank you for that. We've always had a strong community and social value in this neighborhood. The HCD studies were done by volunteers, and we raised the money for them, the original ones. We were set to do it for the rest. We also have a great nature value. Over 130 trees have been identified as heritage significant trees. We do lots of projects for the trees, and you can see the canopy is important. So our context is that the cultural value of Harvard Village is not confined to the 5 streets. We are threatened by demolition, by neglect, and by fire, non-contributing renovations, development, and new density, and we really would like some interim protection while we are waiting to have the study done.
Thank you, Leslie. Are there any questions of the deputant? Not seeing any. Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome.
So we have no more deputants. We'll now go to staff. Not on my list. My list. Do we have another deputant? So, you'd like to speak to us? Please give me your name and give the clerks your information after, because they didn't give it to me. And we'll hear.
Sorry, I already did give them the information. You just didn't receive it.
Okay, your name is?
Paul Farrelly.
Yes, Paul.
And I'm the chair of the Community Preservation Panel for Toronto East York. There's 4 community preservation panels: Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, and Etobicoke, York, in Toronto. We're about a dozen people. We meet every month. We review, and as chair of the panel, I sit on the preservation board. So we spend the month discussing what's coming forward that eventually ends up here, and we have had a lot of consideration and input. And from the point of view of Toronto East York, this heritage prioritization report is quite good. It has addressed a lot of outstanding issues, but there is the big issue of prioritization for the future. And while we are delighted to see work going on, and I share the exact same experience as many of the other deputants as a nominator for the Historic Young Heritage Conservation District. And it takes a long time, and all that voluntary work went into it. The studies took place, but now it's at the OMB. And I would say we're on the verge of a really golden era of heritage, except for those half a dozen HCDs that are at the OMB. And St. Lawrence is first in the queue, and then the others come through. But the other thing I want to raise with you is the general ecology of the community ecology of heritage, in where there's a lot of community capability, energy, enthusiasm, expertise that is vital to understanding what a community is and how a community is defined. And when you listen to the deputants on their concerns about interim protection, it's not just a heritage issue, it's a community planning issue. And as I see in the last 5 years of this committee, there has been a great fusion of heritage and community planning in terms of how the work plans. We had 30 new staff in community planning. You see this in these study areas that are being prioritized. But of course, they're not enough. And, but it's an early warning system in where people at community level have got to understand what's coming down in terms of local area plans, in terms of solid community planning objectives and visions, and which in our case is TO core, which is kind of massive. But then also the specific specialist expertise with respect to heritage. And we have seen planning in just this past year, we have seen the result of planning efforts having significant heritage protection. And these are tools that always exist, identification of a property for a listing. But these batch listings give a protection. So there is terrific progress. There is a terrific amount of heritage content being developed across the city every year. Stacks of it, inches of it, of the story of how these develop, of how these communities and our community got made. And so when you look at how we're all governed under Chapter 103 of the Heritage Act, that hasn't really been addressed since amalgamation. There's a lot of gaps. And it really would be a great thing if, before you left, Chair, that you addressed this and try to bring some cohesion back there, because it's not just heritage. It's heritage and community planning. There's various strategies, tools, approaches. It depends on people raising consciousness and having an ability to learn from each other, community organizations. And all of that mechanism exists in Chapter 103, except Chapter 103, as it's defined, has heritage preservation services in the Culture Department, and you have the philanthropic wing, Heritage Toronto, in where we're not really getting money. We could be getting philanthropic money to help communities be better organized and open to expertise to help protect their community. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for the extension.
Are there questions? There's no questions. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for your positive comments. Okay, I don't have any other speakers this time that I know of. None others identified. We're going to go to questions of staff, but before we do that, if you'd like, I asked the staff if they could give us ahead and prepare a brief outline to us as to what the report says and where they're at. And if that doesn't answer your questions, then we'll go right to your questions. Okay. So, who's going to speak, Greg or Tamara?
I just put up on the screen just an overview of what we're calling loosely the Heritage Toolkit, because I think many of the speakers can, certainly in your consideration of the report, reference to these various pieces of work that we do, all with the view to identifying heritage resources. I certainly appreciate the frustration of the deputants and council members' ongoing frustration with what is an issue that really I feel is in ascension. It's growing in interest across the city, both in our pre-war and post-war neighborhoods. And we are actively pursuing different ways of doing better. I'll just put that out there. It's not perfect, and it's not without observations that people have made that we're getting into conflicts more often. Certainly when development comes to certain neighborhoods, we see it in neighborhoods. For example, in Weston, we see it in commercial areas and in mixed-use areas. So this one slide tries to capture many different things that we're doing. We always have individual listings and designations you'll see on the far left, and that relates to oftentimes you'll see a development application come in, and if it's on the listing, that gives us an ability to have a heritage impact assessment in association with that development, or at least triggers an ability for council to consider a listing and then get a review of the heritage attributes underway. The far right is multiple listings, is something that we've done recently in the last year. You'll have seen, for example, up in Yonge and Eglinton, we did this batch listing, or what we're calling multiple listings, to try to look at an area that's fast changing and get a number of listings done quickly, put us in a better position to assess those heritage attributes. The two middle aspects are more about what this report is about, and this report is really trying to reset the conversation and get us more up to date with your perspective on the total work program and what's previously been committed to. So the report has a series of recommendations in it. Obviously, HCDs are a big part of it. They're a key component of heritage planning. This council, in this term, 5 HCDs have been approved. They're all at the OMB. Surprise, surprise, because, we often get deputants in favor of heritage, but we don't have any deputants today who are against heritage. But believe me, we have lots of people in this city who don't, are less interested. So we have to remember that balanced perspective. And having 5 HCDs at the OMB is just a sign of how much conflict we typically get into. But we are making progress. We have 5 HCDs that have been adopted. We currently have 11 HCDs underway. So there is a substantial amount of work underway. The final reports we anticipate coming forward, finishing up this year and coming forward by Q2 in 2019. The report also identifies something else that we're doing, which is cultural heritage resource assessments, which are a way, kind of, you know, I don't think Mary and Tamara like me to call it Heritage Light, but it's a way of understanding what some of those resources are earlier on in the process, a less complicated way of doing it. So an example of this, for example, I think is a junction where we've got a better sense and we're better prepared to deal with development as it comes on stream. Another aspect of this is something that we've got in the docket for, which gets at a better handle on the overall system that's going on citywide, is something that we're thinking about next year, which is a piece of citywide work. We have a capital budget. It's $1 million. We do better at spending that $1 million in some years more than others. I think some staffing, quite frankly, within that capital envelope would help more assertively spend that money. Our spend rate could be higher. And I think if we had that inside that capital envelope, we could get at these studies a little better. So that's the overall picture of what we're trying to do, and it may frame, perhaps, Mr. Chair, some of the questions that you've got. I don't know. Maybe we'll leave Mary and Tamara for their assistance in answering any questions that you've got. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions now of staff. Councillor Doucette.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this report. I understand where you're coming from, and I appreciate you giving us some outline here. Several years ago, and I can't remember exact year, City Council approved 8 new positions for planning. 4 were to go to HCDs. Did we actually get 4 warm-bodied, wonderful people to help us with HCDs?
That's not my understanding of the City Council. There were 8 development review positions for a 2-year contract, one of which went to an archaeological heritage planner. Several years ago, we were successful in getting a second heritage planner position to work on HCD. So we currently have 2 heritage planners who are devoted exclusively to 2 exercises. One is the HCDs and the other is the planning studies, the heritage planning studies that accompany the larger area planning studies. So we have 2.
So the answer is no. Okay, maybe I'll see. Can anyone else answer? I was under the impression that 4 of those bodies were to go for HCDs. Positions to help you get through your listings.
So through the chair, I can't comment specifically on the 4 staff that you're noting for heritage. There was an allocation, however, for development review purposes of 9 positions. That allocation happened more recently in 2017. One of those staff is heritage archaeology, and that person, I believe, has been hired now.
Good. Well,
there were other staff. They were specifically directed by council to be allocated for development review purposes. So you may be referring to something earlier that is before my time. I can't comment on that.
I think it was
the only earlier one that I'm aware of, and I'm aware of all of them, obviously, is that when we got the capital budget confirmed in 2012, we did suggest that in order to move the work program to the satisfaction of council at the time, we needed at least 1 extra person. So we doubled from 1 to 2.
So when I became a city councillor, at that point in time, residents had to raise the funds themselves to allow staff to do an HCD. We were allowed to get Section 37 allocated to HCDs. Some of us councillors have money sitting in Section 37 allocated to HCDs. Do you need that money? Can you use that money? Or is it a matter that you need to hire permanent staff rather than individual staff just for an HCD?
Yeah, strange to say money is not our issue, because the $1 million capital budget is ample for our purposes, but we would need additional staff resources on a permanent basis, as Greg was suggesting, to maximize our spend rate. The Section 37 monies that have been collected, we can discuss individually because I would believe they can be reallocated.
Okay. So right now we're in a predicament where we've got some on the go, some are OMB, you can't start any new ones until, and yet we're hearing the frustration from all of these people on this list that development is coming in, but we can't start these. So is there something in the 2018 budget allowing you to hire more staff to move some of these forward? And if not, is that what you're looking for? Do you need that?
Through the chair, there's nothing specific in the 2018 budget about additional staff. There's a capital that is there, as it was last year. The report before you, again, as I said, is a reset about trying to finish what we started. And we have started a significant amount of work. And set out for you through these other interim protective measures, steps that can be taken in these other specific geographies to better understand the heritage resources and better integrate the protection of heritage when and if development should occur.
Okay. I have one more quick question. As right now, all of the communities, all the volunteers are having to go building by building by building, which takes a lot of time, a lot of resources on your side. We also have our 4 preservation board panels. I belong to Etobicoke, as does Councillor Campbell. Is there a way for staff to provide each of the panels with the lists of buildings waiting to be listed for each of their areas, and see if some of the volunteers can help provide the information we need, so it really, your staff just have to tick the boxes and they have all the research done, which would get these 500 plus listed buildings into listing and designated DIR status?
While we certainly recognize the extraordinary contribution that community members make in terms of their research and their activism and their commitment in the areas, we do find ourselves in a situation where properties on the Heritage Register, because they are subject to our city's official plan, they do need to be presented in reports that are commensurate with that obligation, which is only to say that it still takes a substantial amount of staff work to assimilate information that's given to us, to augment it as may be necessary, to write the relevant reports and bring them to council.
I wish I had more time, but thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Davis, you had questions?
Thank you. Just so I understand, there are 11 that have to be completed in 2018. You're suggesting, Greg, that they could be done in you're expecting them to be completed by the second quarter 2019?
Ms. McDonald can add, but they're in various stages of being finished. So we're anticipating that we can get that tranche reported out through the various stages by the middle of next year, yes.
And that's the 11 identified in the 2017-18 program?
Yes, it's sort of spread between 2018 and 2019. And just to clarify, not all of them are the delivery of final HCD plans. Some of them are completions of studies, which have an easier delivery process, if you might say. Right. So we have 6 that we know we can tidy up in 2018, and then the following in 2019. So it's divided amongst, in addition to initiating the new ones that we've listed.
So there, of this list of 11, there's some that work will still have to continue into 2019?
Yes, we imagine they'll have to bridge. This is largely due to the fact that we have the hiatus related to the election, and so we can't bring forward reports to council any later than the last council meetings. Some of these will require the bows to be put on them in the fall, so we can bring them back early in the new session.
Okay. And then the new, the list on page 9 with 13. These are all to be done in 2019. Is that correct?
They will be initiated.
Initiated in 2019, yes.
Commencing in 2019, yes.
So someone asked them to be kick-started the first meeting in 2019. Is it your anticipation that will happen? Is that your plan?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
That they be kicked off, like ready to go immediately in 2019?
Not all of them will be able to be kicked off at the same time. It's our suggestion that we bring them on as time allows. So as we complete a study, we can pick up a new study, and we will be reporting that sequencing out through the planning's work program. So you can't actually feasibly start all of them at once. They need to be staggered.
Okay, so it's really hard from what we have here to know exactly how these are going to be phased then. You're saying some of these will be tidied up in 2019, or the old ones, but these new ones won't start until you finish the tidying up and finishing up of the other ones.
Yes,
Is that right?
presumably some of the ones that are finishing off in 2018 will be replaced by new ones in early 2019, and those that are finished in 2019 will be replaced by new ones in the latter part of 2019.
Assembly line, really.
And
Right, but
we
I
also
guess
have to attend to the extraordinary amount of work related to the appeals, right?
Right. I guess the concern is whether or not there's sufficient resources to even achieve those timelines. And so we are about to approve a budget, and if this list of 2019s might even be threatened, or might possibly be pushed into 2020, then I think some of us would really like to see if there's a way that we could find sufficient resources to make sure we keep to at least these timelines, and even to somehow expedite the completion of the 2018s, and make sure we keep to the timeline for the 2019.
I think.
And we, I'm just wondering, is there a way, if we were to request you to report through the executive meeting, the budget executive meeting, on ways that resources could be brought to these studies? Could you do that?
I've had a similar, through the chair, I've had a similar conversation with the chair about using the capital dollars that have been allocated to see what we can do about staffing within that capital, not unlike the way we did it by advancing the zoning bylaw with capital, to see how we can improve the performance, because we are doing, as the report outlines, we're doing quite a lot with the staff that we've got, but obviously, as Ms. McDonald identified, the money may be there, but you need the bodies to advance them, especially understanding the complexity. The variation in the studies can be quite significant, and then you end up with appeals. You've obviously got to manage your appeals.
Councillor Davis, your time is up.
Okay.
And
I have to go to another meeting, unfortunately. So I wouldn't mind
so
being asked if I could have first opportunity to speak. That's
in regards to your last question, I have a motion which I'll be asking the community to support to try to look at ways like that, because the staff have done an awful lot so far.
Great.
So are there other questions? Councillor Nunziata, you had questions.
A couple of questions. I do recall as well, Councillor Doucette, that we did, I think it was a couple of years ago, that, yeah, we put in money into the budget, it was requested for heritage, and we were told that even at meetings, so I don't know what happened there. I have no idea, but we did approve it.
That's your question?
No. My question is, it's not just the money, most of the work that's being done, and I know in Weston, all the research is done through the consultant and on the funds that they've been able to raise in the grant. So if the consultant does the majority of the work, then what is that for the staffing? Because a lot of that is done by the consultant.
You always say at council, you have to let them answer.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
I think it's true division-wide that there is an acknowledgement that there's a tremendous amount of work managing the work of consultants. There's a lot of review that's involved. There's a lot of revisions. We often go through multiple revisions. Consultants don't inherently necessarily write city policy, so city staff have to take the work of consultants and transform it into city policy. We take the lion's share of work in terms of community consultation as the representatives of the city body. I can tell you that my staff has their hands completely full managing the work of the consultants and reviewing it, and then ultimately transforming it into a product for city use. There's also a tremendous amount of public engagement that has to happen.
So if that's the case, and so most of the Heritage District, the groups, panels, are working so hard to raise that money, getting grants, and then they hire consultants that do the work, and then it means nothing because then they have to all be reviewed. So isn't that a waste?
Through you, Mr. Chair.
Like, are we not wasting money there?
The Weston situation is unique in that it started, as with Summerhill, prior to us putting a capital budget in place. Community members are no longer required to fundraise. Community members are no longer hiring their own consultants. The city has taken full responsibility for that. In 2005, the Ontario Heritage Act changed, and HCDs became very powerful planning tools, and they require heritage planners to complete them, to answer to appeals, to represent them at tribunals. So we will be taking a look specifically in your area. We will obviously be making good use of the work that's done. When we kick off your study, we will be so far ahead because of the work that's been done. We will still need to assimilate it, but I would suggest that your study will be very well positioned to move more quickly through the study phase because of the work that you've done. But that is no longer required of any community.
Yeah, but in light of the work that we've done and the resources and all the money that's been raised, I don't know why we haven't started the study, being that we're steps ahead of other districts. Like, why is it still there since 2004? It doesn't make sense.
Did you want an answer?
I mean, I'm not going to get into making you any excuses. I want to be able to advance the program. That's, let's get the wind in our sails, let's get going. I'm not going to make excuses for why something was done or not done.
Thank you. Councillor Campbell, you had questions.
A question. In regard to the interim protective measures, it says that the city's heritage register would provide those properties that are at risk of demolition with an interim protection of 60 days. Why is it limited to 60 days?
The 60 days is mandated under the Ontario Heritage Act.
Okay.
Any property on the Heritage Register is subject to a 60-day review prior to demolition.
Okay. And then it said the staff could further evaluate those properties for a Part 4 designation. What is a Part 4 designation?
A Part 4 designation is an individual protection of a heritage property.
Which does what?
It puts in place a process under the Heritage Act that allows City Council to refuse any demolition or alteration that's proposed for a designated property.
Okay, so what is preventing the city? What's involved with a Part 4 designation? What's preventing the city from embarking on more Part 4 designations? That seems to be much more restrictive. Or gives us much more power.
We actually produce dozens of Part 4 designations every year. There's a very high standard of research and evaluation that's required. There is an associated appeal process. And as you suggest, it is a far more restricted mechanism. And we are generally now moving to multiple batch listings because they're more time effective.
Okay, so I just want to watch my time. So in terms of the burden of proof and the research that's required, that has to stand up stand up where? At the Interim Municipal Board, or where does that have to stand up?
Yes, a few places. For the conservation districts, it's the Ontario Municipal Board. For individual listings, there is no appeal process.
Okay.
And for Part 4 designations, it's the Conservation Review Board.
The Conservation Review Board. So if we designate a property a Part 4 designation, what are the chances of success of the Conservation Review Board? Is it virtual, or is it, 50-50, or?
A Conservation Review Board is an advisory body. City Council has final say, but there is a tribunal and hearing process associated with it.
Okay. To try to understand the Cultural Heritage Resource Assessment, does that precede an HCD study?
It doesn't typically, but what we've recognized is that there are a few areas here that could benefit from a review, which would identify individual listings, could confirm the boundary of the HCD studies. We are typically now doing cultural heritage resource assessments in all large and small scale area planning studies. For example, Midtown in Focus, which you saw the multiple listings for, that went through a cultural heritage resource assessment.
So in regard to the areas on Table 1, Weston Area Phase 2 is the top item. And the report is not specific on when we'll get to those items on Table 1. When would we expect to start working away at the list of the areas on Table 1?
We will start in Q1 of 2019.
Q1 of 2019, okay. And I think my last question is, so how many planning staff do we have working on heritage preservation now?
We have a total staff complement of 24, and they are arranged between policy and development review. We have 2 staff members who are working exclusively on HCD studies, plans, and cultural heritage resource assessments.
So we have 24 staff in heritage preservation, and we have 2 that are working on HCDs?
Yes, development review, the development review teams review all applications for building permits and planning applications for the almost 15,000 registered properties.
Okay. All right. Thank you for the answers.
Thank you. So if I could, I'd like to ask the Deputy City Manager just to give us a little overview of where we're from and where we've gotten to in the last few years through the committee and through council, and trying to look at the heritage preservation of some of the older buildings in the city here.
Well, Mr. Chair, Mary referred to the changes to the Heritage Act in 2005, which gave greater strength to HDCs. I think I came on board in August of 2011, and I would observe at the time that we were principally spending our time on looking at individual properties, on listings, on designating them, on dealing with development applications and reacting to the pressures of a growing city. In 2012, we came forth with a report on HDCs and a policy review that led in 2013 to a capital budget. And that's the 5 that we've been referring to, the 5 capital programs that we try to do every year. And we've been pursuing that with vigor. In 2015, we adopted a prioritization system to basically put the resources in places most desperately in need of the activity. And from that, we went from an ad hoc, community-driven consultant base to a more in-house staff and capital program for heritage. So we've seen quite an evolution. You're now seeing the listings, the batch listings coming forward. Clearly, we're catching up to the demands of the community for good heritage policy, but we still have thousands and thousands of development applications and reviews that we have to undertake, because the work really involves a high standard of research and documentation. It is not trivial. It is very in-depth, slugging, difficult work. And so we've added some additional resources marginally to the program. That's the place where I think we can make some gains on the workload. And I understand there may be a recommendation to do so through the budget. So that would be my observations, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And the talk we had about hiring some students, can you update Greg, or your staff as to where we're at looking at
I
it?
believe we have a report coming forward on that to the February PGM about a possible student program, yes.
So to do what?
The survey work? You want to?
I'm going to let Tamara speak to this. She's been the one doing the thinking about it.
The student program we're looking at, there's some opportunities through the federal youth employment of hiring one intern to help us as we set up as part of our feasibility study that we've been actioned to do for the citywide heritage survey. This could also be the groundwork for a more expanded student program in the years to follow.
And Mr. Lintern, as part of the review, the development review process, are we going to be looking at the issue of heritage when we look from the start to the end of how an application works to see ways we might be able to improve that as well?
I think to the extent that that's been outlined, I believe there is a review of it. It may not be as deep a dive as we may need to do as a second step, but it is part of the development and review process and will be canvassed.
Thank you. Are there any other questions of staff? Not seeing any. Are there speakers? Councillor Doucette.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start by thanking staff for this report. And I know they're working very, very hard to get through at least the study section of an HCD. I understand the frustration of residents. As you probably guessed, Junction is in my neighborhood, and we are seeing quite a lot of pressure from developments coming on to Dundas now. And we are very concerned that we do have buildings which should have heritage designation. And thanks to our volunteers, Tina is leading the charge, we are doing them building by building by building. We know that takes up a lot of staff time. We understand that. So what I've heard today is we got the money, we just need some more bodies. I know there's going to be a motion coming forward. So for instance, if we've got 2 staff working on them now, maybe we should have 4 staff working on HCDs to be able to get these ones moving forward. We can't help them going to OMB. I personally know that not everyone wants HCDs. And I know that the community consultation is vital. And I know you've got to come out to the community before you start doing things to explain to residents what an HCD is, so everyone understands. It might not just be built form, it might be the archaeological side of things. There's more aspects to it. Over the last few years, I have learned far more about HCDs than I thought actually existed. But we have to be out in our communities. Some of our communities, some residents feel that if your single-family home is within an HCD, you can't do a thing to it. That's not the case, as we've also found out in some areas where I have studies going on right now. Preservation looks at the building which is being designated and works with the owners to allow them to do certain renovations and changing the building to a certain extent. So really, I think our priority, and I'm happy to see that we are looking at other areas and other angles to try and move these last ones forward. They're not going to be the last. There's going to be other areas coming up. The report shows that some of these have been on the list since 2004, where I know the Junction hasn't been on that long, but we are now under dire pressure. And different areas of the city get different pressures at different times. Junction area was bigger than this. They have had to narrow it down to the most pressing areas, but I will say an avenue like Hyde Park Avenue is under pressure. Before, as a city councillor, as residents, we were out there fighting to keep a beautiful building where a developer wanted to come in, knock it down and sever the property. You've got a 50-foot lot. You can sever the property and build 2 houses, but it wouldn't have been keeping in the character of that street. And that's what we and the community are trying to protect. It's not just the commercial strips where we do get big development. It's also in our neighborhoods where we get single-family homes wanting to be demolished, and you get a very modern, very metal, glass, square box, which doesn't fit into what is there. I don't think anyone's saying don't renovate your building. We're just asking you to do it in the character of the community, which can be stunning. It can give you all that family space you want, but let's keep at least the facade in the character of the neighborhood. So I know residents aren't going away. I know they're very dedicated, and I know councillors aren't going away. We're very dedicated to preserve the buildings which should be preserved, and therefore, if we can get more staff onto this, you definitely got my vote, and I know that the councillors will stay engaged with preservation and help you in any way we can to move these projects forward. So thank you very much. And I'm under time. There you go.
Thank you. Councillor Nunziata.
Thank you. I do have a motion that Councillor Bylaw is going to move on my behalf. We can put it on the screen. Okay. I'm not going to read the motion, but it's very clear. You know, so we were told by staff that it's a couple of years ago when we went through the budget that they were requesting money in the budget to hire more planners for heritage, which we did. It was my understanding we did. Now we find out no, in fact, they didn't. You know, if it's a matter of the budget, earlier today we talked about the Living in the City survey, which cost $200,000. So, I mean, that money should be spent for heritage rather than a survey. You know, like, it's very clear that heritage and these properties that are listed in the report are priority. And I'm going to speak on behalf of Weston, because Weston has been working on it for a number of years, since, as Sherry mentioned, since 2003. And the Weston area Phase 2, which was in 2004, they've been working very hard. They received a Trillium grant. They've been raising funds. They're doing fundraising at the farmers market and all the events, and they have monthly meetings. The community is very engaged. They're in light of what's happened just recently in the past few years with the new transit in the area, the GO Station, the Up Express, and all that transit that's coming in, there are tons and tons of applications that are coming in that our developers are buying. They want to demolish, and they want to sever the property into two separate lots. And we are constantly, Sherry and the community, going to the Committee of Adjustment, speaking against these applications, which they get refused at the Committee of Adjustment, and then we end up at the OMB. There's been tons of them. And and unfortunately, when it goes to the Committee of Adjustment, the staff are not communicating to the Committee of Adjustment that these homes that are applying for severance are in the Phase 2 heritage study area. So we have to go and argue that, because that information is not brought forward to the Committee of Adjustment on all of them. We're always arguing about that. Now, just recently, there was a Committee of Adjustment application which was refused, and we went to the OMB of February 2017. It was severance, and we just received the decision last week. It's taken a year, and this was severance on a property in Weston. And the news, I mean, the good news is that the OMB refused it. And it took a whole year, but they refused it. But then there's been others that were approved. And so we're fighting. We're constantly fighting. We are under a lot of pressure. And we have another one coming up in February, another Committee of Adjustment application in the Phase 2 heritage study area. And I've been trying to work with staff for the past few years, and to expedite Weston, being that we've been since 2004. That's 14 years it's taken. And so I hope that the committee will support the motion. And I have spoken to staff about this, and the staff are fine with this motion. As a matter of fact, they've helped draft up this motion. So if I can ask the committee for support, and thank you.
Thank you. We bring it into committee. I have a motion which I can put up if you wish. I am flashing again on my screen, so I'll read it. Request the acting chief planner, executive director, city planning to report directly to city council on means to advance the multi-year heritage work program, including consideration of retaining a temporary project manager in 2018, utilizing funding from the city planning capital budget. And then adopt 2 staff recommendations and 2 recommendations from the preservation board. And in speaking to that, part of the staff have put together a plan which they'll be advancing and they believe is there a way to shut the screen off? This is. Okay. Sorry. Staff have been working with the committee support and council support to increase the work in the Heritage Division to start doing more HCD studies, to look more at the needs that we have to protect buildings in the city. At the same time, there's been a lot more pressure because of additional development within the city. We can't use heritage studies to stop intensification. We can use heritage studies to protect beautiful buildings and the type of buildings we want to save within the city. With that in mind, the issue comes up with, if you get approval in 2019 for additional funds, you probably won't hire the staff until the middle or the end of 2019, because that's just the time that it takes. So the reason for the motion is to have staff look at what we can do to move forward, to give better support for the division within the work plan that they have, within the staging that they have, and ways that we can increase that and support it. And one of the ways to do that is to look at the capital budget, because some of these studies are within that. So that's the intention of it. I think that this committee and council should be quite proud of the work and the advancement that we've done in the last 4 or 5 years in here, and particularly this term of council, to support the needs of preserving the ambiance and some of the beautiful old buildings that the city has. We have changed the way we do business. We have changed the way we look at them. We have supported the staffing. We have supported the conservation districts. And we still have the fact that we do get appeal to the Ontario Municipal Board, which we have to deal with. We've also asked, and that was a question of the acting chief planner, that in the development review process, we remember that there's a spot in the review from the time an application comes in to the time we finish with the development through the building division, that there's a spot that we have to look at of heritage to make sure that nothing falls through the cracks, and do the best that we can there. So I appreciate the hard work the staff have done. I appreciate the work that our communities have in bringing it to us. I think we've got a lot more information than we've ever had on how we work in heritage in the city, and a lot more support. I think the staff see that from this committee and from council. So with that, I have my motion and the staff recommendations. Additional speakers? Councillor Campbell?
Well, listen, obviously heritage is very important to the citizens of Toronto. It's important to me. I've often been dismayed at the loss of buildings downtown. I, like Councillors Doucette and Nunziata, having sat on the budget committee, I recall us adding staff to heritage. I don't know if they were added to planning and then redeployed to other areas and not put into this specific area of study and focus where they thought they were. And hope maybe staff can have a look at that. Maybe it's not a question of adding more staff, but redeploying more staff so they can get to this very important to-do list. Thank you.
Thank you. No other speakers, so Councillor Bilo is moving Councillor Nunziata's motion. A wonderful speech. So the motion from Councillor Bilo on behalf of Councillor Nunziata. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. I have a motion by the chair to get an additional report to council and moving recommendations 5 and 6 from the Toronto Preservation Panel. All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. The staff recommendations. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Am I okay there, Madam Clerk? Okay, so the item is completed. We have one item left, which is the additional item. We have a speaker, 2 speakers. We have Joy Connolly. So if I can get our committee's attention. Okay, so you're here to speak. The motion that's in front of us is to get a report to council. You have your 5 minutes. Joy?
Thank you. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm a member of the Homecoming Coalition, a human rights organization founded to ensure planning practices promote inclusion, not exclusion. But today I come with a mandate, not only from Homecoming, but from many other organizations as well. Social Planning Toronto, and we have Sean Mahar, who will also speak on behalf of them, the Wellesley Institute, the Co-op Housing Federation, Ontario Region, the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association, the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario, ACORN, and the Federation of Metro Tenants. Each of these organizations plays its own part in promoting the well-being of this city, but on this issue, we speak as one. The draft inclusionary zoning regulations as presented by the Ontario government on December 18th fall short, very far short, of the sort of program Toronto needs. The fundamental problem is this. When the Ontario government introduced legislation that would permit municipalities to enact their own inclusionary zoning policies, it described the legislation as giving tools to municipalities and restoring local decision-making. It was permission the City of Toronto had asked for repeatedly, and for good reason. As Toronto's former chief planner noted, if Toronto had had even a modest inclusionary zoning program, it could have generated 12,000 units of affordable housing in the past 5 years. That's more than was generated through all new affordable housing programs in Toronto combined. We need these affordable homes for our own children, for a growing population, for people who work in Toronto but are now driving 2 hours to get here. But these regulations seem to have forgotten that the aim was to permit municipalities to act, as instead tied their hands, with limitations that are unheard of south of the border, where over 800 jurisdictions use inclusionary zoning to generate affordable housing. The result? We're estimated, it's a casual analysis, but under these regulations, Toronto might be able to create 100 to 200 sort of affordable ownership homes. There are many restrictions, but I'm going to highlight 4. The portion of affordable units generated is a maximum of 5% or up to 10% near high-density transit station areas. For most municipalities in the U.S., the portion is 15 to 20%. Fewer than 10% of municipalities have limits of 10% or lower. In New York City, it's 50%. The important point is this, that each municipality sets its own rules, working with developers, planners, advocates, and hiring independent consultants to find that sweet spot that creates the most affordable housing while still stimulating new housing supply. Second, these regulations require municipalities to pay 40% of the cost of affordable units and then tie affordability levels to this contribution. Some municipalities in the U.S. do offer incentives to developers, but they're not required to, and studies show that they don't get more affordable housing by doing so. Third, affordability is limited only to ownership housing, not new rental buildings, and its rental is a top priority for us. And fourth, the regs put a 20 to 30-year time limit on the affordability period. This just punts the affordable housing crisis to the next generation, and we gain nothing by doing so. The premise here seems to be that the Ontario government needs to protect developers from rogue municipalities. But the experience in the U.S. tells us it's not developers that absorb the costs of creating affordable homes, and it's not the other people living in the building who are charged what the market will bear no matter what. What inclusionary zoning does is it gently lowers the price of land. That's the flexible part. It means land speculators will get a return incidentally made possible by public investment in transit, roads, parks, and so on, but maybe just not as much as they hoped. And why should we be supporting inflated land prices at the expense of ordinary people who just need a home to live in? This is not inclusion. This is not recognizing that, as the National Housing Strategy just announced says, housing rights are human rights. We organizations are going to do our part to return these regs to the legislation's original purpose, to let municipalities decide on the policies that will permit development to flourish and create affordable housing at the same time. But as the City of Toronto, you have a bigger voice than us all. So we urge you to call upon your staff to bring forward recommendations for Ontario. It's a lot of work, but the payoff is huge. We are right behind you. Thank you.
Question, Councillor Perks.
So, Joy, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. You offered two numbers. One, which was a projection for how many affordable units we could build with a good inclusionary zoning bylaw. What was that number?
Well, according to the former chief planner, it was over a 5-year period,
Yes.
12,000 units.
12,000, and I think you gave a second number, which is what you imagine would be possible under this?
Yes, my second number is not a firm number, but based on
appreciate
early
that.
analysis, people are thinking between 100 and 200
Per
units
year.
of affordable ownership.
Is that per year?
Per year.
So over a 5-year period, 500 to 1,000. So this is less than 1/10 of what the former chief planner projected a good inclusionary zoning bylaw could generate.
That's correct.
And you said you were speaking on behalf of a number of organizations today. Could you just tell me what they were?
Sure. So, well, Social Planning Toronto is part of the group. The Wellesley Institute, the Co-op Housing Federation, Ontario Region, the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association, the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario, ACORN, and the Federation of Metro Tenants.
Thank you very much for coming today, Joy.
Thank you.
What is that? Oh, okay. Question. I wasn't quite sure what it was. You moved forward and kind of made some moves there. Councillor Barlow, questions.
Just a quick question, Joy. We know that the province is trying to also create legislation to an entire province.
Yes.
And this is complicated legislation. The numbers work very differently, in Kingston that it work in Toronto. We even see it inside our city that is very different. There's different scenarios. Is that also one of the reasons that you think more should be left to the municipalities so they can respond to the economics and the needs of each municipality individually and create a legislation that works economically as well as socially for the city?
Absolutely. The initial legislation was good in that it was permissive legislation. It created an umbrella under which cities, including Toronto, which always had asked for this, to be able to move forward. These restrictions ignore the variations among municipalities.
Because you would agree, and I think the sector would agree with what Steph has been telling us, is that we have to find that soft spot, right, where development continues to happen, because that's the way we're going to get the units, but that we get as much as affordable housing as possible. So there's that equilibrium between the units that we're getting, but also there's the affordability factor coming into play as well. Is that what we need to have to look at this issue, as to find that soft spot, that economic soft spot that will continue it to allow it to happen?
I had the opportunity to attend a very interesting conference in Oakland, California, about inclusionary zoning. And what was striking there is that there were no state regulations that said, municipalities, you can only do this. They were permissive. Every municipality created their own policies based on the needs. And so they varied tremendously based on, as you say, the sweet spot and the needs of the municipalities. So, for example, Cambridge, Massachusetts, their approach was, for us, the number of units isn't the important thing. We need large units. So they based it not on number of units, but square footage in a building. That was their innovations. Others wanted to create money for new nonprofit housing. Others, they wanted inclusion in the building. These are judgment calls that are made by each municipality to meet their own needs.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Sean Mager, you also wanted to speak to us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for including this on the agenda today. I know we're up against a very rapid deadline from the province. Social Planning Toronto has been working on the inclusionary zoning file for many years, including the forum that we held 3 years ago jointly with the city to raise the issues of what we could do with inclusionary zoning. And this last year has been a very important year for that policy, because through concerted work by the city and by the advocacy community and the housing provision community, we've been able to get legislation through. And I think it's worth noting that that legislation went through after extensive consultation, detailed discussion, giant roundtables, huge forums. And the central themes of those discussions were: how big should the set-asides be? What should be the duration of the affordable housing? And should there be any kind of compensation to developers for participating in the program? That discussion happened extensively prior to the legislation, and the legislation reached a very sensible conclusion, which is, as the councillor just said, municipalities have very different housing needs and very different housing markets, and the legislation should give municipalities the flexibility to build their own inclusionary zoning strategies that reflect their own markets. Sadly, just on the Friday afternoon, just 2 days before Christmas, the draft regulations that accompany that legislation came out, and they essentially undid every single thing that the whole consultation and the legislation decided in the first place. They set very narrow caps on how much affordable housing can be built. In fact, they set a 5% limit on how many units you could ask developers to set aside. That is an unusual limit. In the United States, there are very, very few programs, and in Canada, there are very, very few programs that set a cap that low. In fact, 20% is a much more common example in the United States. There are over 100 municipalities that have 20% caps. New York City has a 50% cap. But rather than tell municipalities what their cap should be, the legislation should give Kingston the right to set a cap at what's appropriate for Kingston, and Toronto the right to set a cap of what's appropriate for Toronto. There should be no cap in the legislation. Similarly, the regulation should not do what it now does, which is ban municipalities from making housing affordable for a long period of time. You're not allowed to make housing affordable for more than 30 years under these regulations. So if you come up with a strategy that says, we got a way to make housing affordable for 50 years or 99 years or perpetually, the regulation would ban you from doing that, which makes absolutely no sense. And the legislation was silent on that topic for exactly that reason. The other thing that wasn't in the legislation that is in the regulations is a thing that they call now measures and incentives. And believe it or not, these are rules that say municipalities and their taxpayers have to pay developers to comply with the law. That this is also a very odd provision, and a provision that is very unusual in the United States. Very few American inclusionary zone, of the hundreds and hundreds of inclusionary zoning programs in the United States, very few make any provision at all for compensation to developers, and even those ones rarely use those provisions because, in fact, it is possible for, in fact, it's consistently the case that inclusionary zoning works just fine without asking taxpayers to subsidize developers under the program. In fact, as Joy Connolly mentioned, the evidence is that what happens is the cost of the inclusionary units passes back to something that tends to slow the inflation on land prices, something that adds another benefit to cities like Toronto, where land prices are kind of out of control, and something that tends to dampen them down would be useful for the whole of the housing market, not just for inclusionary zoning. It's also worth noting that there are a couple of other provisions in the regulations that are problematic. One is that the regulations, like the legislation, entitle people to provide inclusionary zoning units off-site, which is a very good idea. So you could build a big condo tower and then say, you know what, I'm going to ask the Cooperative Housing Federation to build a co-op down the block and provide the affordable housing there. And not always does affordable housing mix perfectly well into big condos, so there's some logic to that. Unfortunately, the regulations, for some reason, say you can't use the units in an off-site development unless 50% of the units are market units, which basically means that the nonprofit housing world will not participate in that program. They can't afford, they don't have the capital or the internal capacity to build twice as many units as they really need to in order to comply with that. So only the development industry will participate in that, even though what we know is that we get more units of longer duration and affordability when the affordable housing and nonprofit housing world participates. So the nonprofit housing community should be exempted from that constraint, certainly. Similarly, there's a provision that excludes purpose-built rental, and we understand why that's attractive as an option. Unfortunately, if you look at the Toronto housing market, most of the purpose-built rental that's going up is high-end purpose-built rental, which ought to participate in an inclusionary zoning policy. And so the regulations shouldn't tell every single market not to use purpose-built rental, because in some markets, purpose-built rental makes sense. So again, they should leave it up to the municipalities, who, in my view, are responsible stewards of their development, to make that choice for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Councillor Perks.
Thank you. Sean, so do you view the proposal that the province of Ontario has put forward as an improvement over our current ability to use Section 37 funds to generate affordable housing?
So the legislation that they passed was a significant improvement. It gave us the potential for stable, consistent, reliable system of providing for community benefits from development. These regulations essentially repeal the existing legislation and replace it with exactly the legislation that the community asked and the city asked the province not to pass, which gives us substantially less than we could probably bargain in a case-by-case basis from Section 37. A 5% cap on affordable units at a maximum of 30 years of affordability is something I think just about any city councillor could negotiate with a developer in their area.
So this could actually be worse than our current circumstance in some ways.
It could be. It certainly is far, far worse than the legislation that they passed.
Thank you.
Councillor Campbell.
You said that rental stock is excluded from exclusionary zoning?
So under the regulations, you would not be able to ask a developer who is building purpose-built rental to create affordable units in that building. So if you built a purpose-built...
Why is that?
We do now. I assume it's because the province has taken several steps to try and encourage the creation of purpose-built rental.
Well, they've actually just done the opposite, because they've put in caps on increases. They just extended that, right? I mean, the what do you call it? The rent control. Yeah. Sorry. Well, it's probably a C.D. Howe view, but I mean, that's...
Yeah, our analysis and the preponderance of statistical research on the development of purpose-built rental and affordable purpose-built rental suggests that rent controls have very little adverse impact on the creation of purpose-built rental. Public investment tends to be the driver of affordable rental housing.
But when you have rent controls, does not then the construction of purpose-built rental, if it doesn't discourage the construction, does it not encourage higher rents, higher rental, more upscale?
Rent control, again, there's not a strong research base that suggests that that's the case. But what we certainly do see as the pattern that we're getting is, yes, the purpose-built rental that is coming is tending to be higher rent, and as a consequence, it's an ideal candidate for inclusionary zoning, and yet these regulations would exclude it from participating and would exclude you from asking those buildings to participate.
So inclusionary zoning is only intended for basically condominiums?
The way these regulations are written, it would really only apply to condominiums. In fact, inclusionary zoning has been a very useful tool in many, many jurisdictions for creating affordable rental housing and for creating affordable rental housing over a long period of time. These regulations make that nearly impossible.
So last question. So where in Canada has it been most effective?
Most of the evidence actually is in U.S. jurisdictions. There is inclusionary zoning systems in Montreal that have been successful, but really the preponderance of data that we have is from the U.S., where the housing markets are not terribly dissimilar from our housing market.
I'm just wondering, is this in Vancouver?
No, in Montreal they have a good inclusionary zoning system.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Councillor DiCiano, you had questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and Sean, just a couple questions, because I'm confused on who the province is actually working to help here.
I share your distress, Councillor.
Yeah, it's a little disturbing. So, have they said why developers need incentives to build affordable housing? Is there a reason behind it? Is there, in the jurisdictions that you see that this is, that they are able to build a lot of affordable housing, are there incentives in place there?
In the jurisdictions that have used inclusionary zoning, incentives are relatively uncommon. And in fact, even in the jurisdictions where they're permitted, they're rarely used, because in fact incentives turn out not to be necessary to make inclusionary zoning work. I will tell you, because I participated in some of the roundtables, the argument that was given by the development community for why incentives should be forced on municipalities. Please. And the argument they made was that no municipality would ever provide incentives to developers to build affordable housing unless they were forced to by the province of Ontario, which was interesting because the week before this city council, the week before that statement was made, this city council passed all of the open door provisions and all of the incentive programs to create affordable housing. And it's pretty clear that municipalities are prepared to play ball with the development community to make sure the development happens and that it generates affordable housing. The province of Ontario, in writing these regulations, has been convinced by someone that municipalities will not. They will actually destroy all development in their jurisdictions unless forced to play ball in a particular kind of way and to play exactly the same ball game in Toronto as in Kingston and Windsor and Peterborough and Ottawa. And I'm afraid, Councillor, I cannot tell you why they reached that conclusion.
Okay.
Last questioner, and then I was going to do a motion to extend so we can move the motions.
Okay, you know what, I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll take it offline a little bit, but thank you very much.
Thank you. So, Councillor Barlow, you wish to move a motion to extend to complete the item?
Yes, and a quick question, just one very quick question
First,
that
a
hasn't been
motion
asked.
to extend to complete the item. All those in favor?
Yeah.
Any opposed? That's carried. Questions of the deputant?
Sean, will all the organizations be making submissions? Because this is a consultation period, so the city will be making submission. Will the sector also be making different submissions? Well, they're not that they're common, but they're individual submissions, I should say, to the minister.
Yeah, so there's been an ongoing discussion around inclusionary zoning across the housing providers and housing advocates in Toronto for the last couple of years, and that conversation's ongoing. All of the participants in that will be making submissions, even though the deadline is fairly tight, it's just a couple of weeks from now, and all of them will be making points very, very similar to the ones that I just made and that Joy just made.
Thank you.
And we encourage the city to make a submission and make one also on those same points.
Thank you. So we'll bring this into committee. Councillor Perks, it was your item because you submitted it to us. Do you want to go first?
Very quickly, I understand Councillor Bailao and yourself have been working on some motions pertaining to this, and I'm comfortable with whatever way you want to go forward, as long as City Council has an opportunity to speak on this as quickly as possible. It is rare that I have seen such a monstrous failure in public policy as this one. It actually achieves the exact opposite of everything that it was supposed to achieve. It reduces the likelihood, in my view, of getting more affordable housing built in the City of Toronto rather than increasing it. It creates negative incentives, if you will. It's just a giant failure in public policy, and given that I think there isn't a member of Toronto City Council who doesn't understand that we have an affordability crisis here in the City of Toronto, I think it's important we have that opportunity to speak urgently with one voice on this issue. So I encourage you to all support something that gets this to Council as quickly as possible, because we have to speak out on this right now.
Thank you. Councillor Barlow?
Yes, we have. I have a motion. So, as you know, we've been working with the province for a couple of years now. I've been in many of the consultations that the deputants spoke here about. They've consulted with our Affordable Housing Office, and Planning has been working together and submitting our several feedback on this. And one of the concerns that we always expressed on this is that this needs to be a partnership, we understand, with all orders of government, and we feel like right now it's just on our backs. That's what has been put. It's basically almost a downloading of building housing on municipalities, because this is an entire program. That's what it is. We've been doing some math, and the 40% translates into thousands of dollars that the city would have to create of incentives. It's millions of dollars. And I call this feeling good legislation. You know, when you pass legislation that results in nothing, because there's no municipality, I believe, in this province that will actually enact this legislation, and this could actually, at the end, translate into units. And I think that's what we're at risk in here. And so there has been conversations with other municipalities. I know that Councillor Layton has been having conversations with other councillors across the province, and that is being worked on. We will be sending a letter just before the deadline. The deadline is February 1st, and therefore we are asking staff to report to council, but because it's so close to the deadline, I will be giving some highlights of some of our concerns, which are very much in line with what the deputants spoke about in here. But then the whole report will go to council. We are also asking staff to continue the conversations with the province. The city has done quite a bit of work in this, and this is complex legislation. Let's not think that it's not. I remember speaking with the chief housing officer from New York, and one of the first things she said was, make sure that you look at this as also with the economic lenses as well, and that stuck with me. And so we went out. We have studied the economics of this issue to make sure that it works. We have gotten consultants. We have looked at the performers. We have looked at the financial impact that this will have on the industry, on the city, and on the affordability of the units. So we have that. And we know that it's complex legislation, but we know for sure that we're well prepared to put our case forward. We have put our case forward, but it seems like the message did not get across completely. We're going to put it informal to council, and I'm fairly confident that we're going to get a strong support and mandate from council on the city's position on this legislation. This is important legislation that could translate into a significant amount of units in affordable housing, but in the way that it is right now, there are some issues that need to be addressed, and I think that the consultation period would allow us to give that feedback to the province as well. So I hope that I can have the support not only to have this going to council, but have staff continuing the conversation. It is really important that we continue that conversation with staff. And like I said, I will be also expressing our concerns, some of our concerns as housing advocate as well, and because I've been involved in the conversations, and so I'll be reiterating some of the concerns that have been put forward in the past since day one, and looking forward to having the discussion at council and hopefully a strong support on our position.
Thank you. So I have a motion, and I will add to that to refer the item number 1 from Councillor Barlow to the special meeting unless she's satisfied with the special meeting, and I'll speak to it. My motion is to have a special meeting of the Planning and Growth Committee prior to the council meeting, so staff can bring a report to us that fully outlines the impacts of the legislation, which we've been able to get yet, but they've told me they can do, and I'm actually thinking of the 25th, the day after the executive committee, to come and at least have that. It'll give an opportunity and if we don't have a meeting, then have the report go directly to council. But from speaking to some of my colleagues, I believe they're able to attend on the 25th. I haven't had a chance to canvass everyone. The reason for it as well is that we're hearing today from deputants who have information on a policy matter, which is a planning policy matter that we don't even have here yet, that it's important for us to have the staff perspective and their responses they'd like council to give, and the ability to deal with that and consider that with ourselves and all of our colleagues prior to the council meeting. I think it can give a much better response if we have that report, can consider it, and if we have further questions, we can have those in place for the time that report goes to council and still make the timeline that the province wants. I have no problem with the second part of my colleague's motion to request staff to continue discussions. I think it's absolutely right, and as a housing advocate, you're absolutely, fair to bring your concerns out to it. But I truly believe that I couldn't add it to this agenda, and I can't get a report from staff much before that, but they've told me that they can't have a report for that meeting, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. In the issue that's in front of us, developers never pay for anything. It's always the people that purchase the units pay, but in this case, it seems to be that the taxpayer is going to pay to achieve much less than we had ever wanted to achieve, and you can achieve more. Some of the issues I understand are here are Section 37 is going to go away, get rid of our parks, get rid of parking standards, redirect infrastructure funds that we desperately need in our development charges to support the development, to support affordable housing. It seems to be totally contradictory, and really, in many ways, it almost looks like a sham to say I'm doing something when I'm not.
Mr. Chair, oh, sorry.
Can I finish my?
Yes.
Oh, I stopped my time at just over 2 minutes. Ask me anything after. But I really have a concern because I don't know enough. I don't know enough today to be able to deal with it. But it definitely doesn't seem to be supportive from our housing advocate, from people that know it, from our own staff, to actually move things forward. It seems to be moving things backwards in a way that we never wanted to have happen. And we've actually shown in developing sites within Build Toronto, which is now Toronto Realty Company, that we don't need 5%, we don't need 10%, we can get 20%, we can get 50% of a development to be affordable in some parts of the city and still have a profitable development out there and put some support into it. And we've done the same thing with rental. We have affordable rental units being built in the city through the policies that we have in place. And this legislation is going to bring everything that we're doing to a halt. Now, we definitely need some type of legislation to help us move forward with inclusionary zoning to make sure that people understand in the development industry what's needed and how to work with it. But we also need flexibility within that, and I think municipalities do across the province to be able to make things work. And from the brief information that I know about the provincial regulations that are going forward, it just isn't going to happen. We are not going to be able to achieve the amount of affordable housing that we could. We won't be able to achieve it comprehensively with the development community. We won't be able to afford it because it looks to me like you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in support from the City of Toronto, putting into to prop up the affordability issue for private developers. It doesn't make sense. And I want it to make sense before council makes a decision, so we have that background. So I hope you can support, and I don't know, Councillor Barlow, if you're okay to withdraw your first part of the motion that goes to council for a report there. If you're okay to support it coming to a special meeting would be helpful. But I'd like to do that, have it here, and then send it to council. And if for some reason, as I said, my motion is, if for some reason we can't get the meeting together, it will definitely go to council. That is my motion, that we try first to have the meeting and get quorum, and if we can't, it'll go to council with the report, but one way or the other, the item will be at the council meeting. So that's my speaking. Questions of the speaker?
Okay, questions of the speaker. So this is not about us making a decision about inclusionary zoning. This is about us commenting on the legislations, right? So and all the stakeholders, everybody is giving the feedback. Staff and I actually have consulted with the majority of the councillors a while ago when the legislation came through. So all these positions about the Section 37, about the costs of the incentives, have been noted by staff through meetings with individual numbers of councillors that we've been giving this feedback based on those meetings for 2 years now. You do understand that? Okay, because this is questions and stuff. So I'm just...
I understand that a very poor Christmas gift was given to municipalities on the 22nd of December that seemed to be a bomb in the middle of affordable housing instead of a gift that would seem things would go forward. It's often like Scrooge showed up to mess up everything that's been going on. And all that I want to do is be sure that there's a report in the forum that we have where we can have some discussion before it goes to council, where we make a formal response to it. And the example, it might even be earlier today when it came to the issues of heritage. Although we know and we've talked and we've been there, it's still a difficult item to understand, and this is an extremely difficult item. So I'm not looking to take up a day at council on it if we can get the information in advance, but if we have to, we will. So I'm not one that looks for extra meetings, but I can't see in an item like this where it should just go directly to council and could get lost in other items that may become priority at council, and all of a sudden it's the third day at the end of the day that we're trying to deal with it, and it might not be appropriate. And I truly think that we have tremendous support right across council for affordable housing, but I think that people should understand
And for our position, I think that council will be very much...
But we also have an industry that lobbies against things that we do and might be misinforming or misinform some of our colleagues between now and council as well with a different perspective on it, because I don't believe that this was just a dream that was thought up by the minister. I believe this was under some type of pressure that this must have come forward to make it look like it's good, but it looks good, taste it, but actually it's rotten. And that's the problem with it. So I think that we have to be cautious as to what our colleagues know. So I'm just looking to have a special meeting for that. Yes, Councillor.
Mr. Chair,
are you okay with your questions, Councillor Barlow?
I'm going to support your motion, Mr. Chair. Like you said, this is a complex matter, and I think that, and there's a lot of, obviously, planning points within this legislation. So I think it would be helpful if this committee looked at this in greater detail. We've had now 3 council sessions that we haven't been able to finish, and I think the last council session we didn't, and this is going to take up a lot of time, and I think in order to get the right response back to the province, if this committee further understood it in detail, when it comes to council, we've got 6 members of council who would be better educated on this, that could help the rest of council understand the complexities of the issue. So I would, although I'm not into extra meetings either, I'm more than willing to have your motion go forward.
Just to speak quickly, so I've just spoken to Councillor Bailão, and I believe that if we approve your motion and parts 2 and 3 of hers, then we're home free. So let's just do that.
There's a revised motion. She's going to write a letter without asking us. So can we put up Councillor Barlow's revised motion, Councillor Perks? So, but I have to delete, we can only vote on 2 from hers. So, okay. So then, Councillor Barlow, are you okay withdrawing your part 3, or do we have to vote on it separately?
Is she okay with withdrawing part 1?
Or part 1? Correct. 2. That's right. Councillor Barlow, are you all right with that?
There's a concern.
Okay, there's a concern somewhere. What is the concern?
Councillor Shiner's motion says the staff have only to report in the event that a meeting does not happen. Councillor Bilal's motion is saying report in any case.
We're deferring, we're removing part one. We will report in any case. So can we vote then together on part two of Councillor Barlow's motion and parts, and my motion? So we're going to vote on part two of Councillor Barlow's motion. No, the request staff to continue discussions are important. On part two, all those in favor? Opposed? That's carried. Councillor Barlow? So I don't want to say something for you. You're okay with withdrawing your part one in favor of my motion? It creates a conflict. But it creates a conflict, staff have said. Yes, we will. It works. Okay. Staff said there is. Then on the motion that I moved, all those in favor? Opposed? Any opposed? That's carried. That's our business for today. We're concluded. Thank you all for your help. Motion to adjourn. Tell me what you...